The Rockstar's Email Order Bride. Book 2 in the Romance Island Resort series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Chris from Google. 1. Jason didn't wait for the rotors to stop before he leaped out of the helicopter door and sprinted for the hotel entrance. "Welcome to Romance Island Resort, sir. Enjoy your stay," came the pilot's voice behind him, but Jason wasn't listening. He burst through the door and skidded to a stop in front of the reception desk. "Where's Audra?" Jason demanded. She was the only girl who could make him forget Angel. The only girl who could make this right. He needed her. Now. The blonde girl at reception stared at him. "We don't have anyone named Audra here, sir." "Of course you do. Best maid I ever met. Tell her I'm here and to meet me at my accommodation. I had Villa Maxima last time. The one with the huge spa tub in the bathroom. And make sure we have plenty of mango beer. Mangoes are her favorite." A second girl sidled behind the desk beside to the blonde. She looked Japanese, but her accent had Aussie overtones as she asked, "Did you say Audra?" She was mad about mangoes. "I bet Audra's missing those now she's in Antarctica." Jason laughed. "Antarctica? Don't be ridiculous." He turned his eyes back to the blonde. "Can you let her know I'm here?" She looked lost until her eyes fixed on someone behind Jason. "Oh, Mr. Meyer, this man's looking for Audra. He doesn't believe that she's gone." An older man with a professional smile held out his hand. "Good morning, Mr. R. Felix?" "Jason Felix." Jason's firm handshake almost crushed the other man's fingers in his eagerness. "Where's Audra?" "Like Hannah said, she's in Antarctica, Mr. Felix. Audra no longer works here." Jason's heart plummeted. No Angel, no Audra. What was a rock star supposed to do when the girl he wanted didn't want him? "Is there anything else we can help you with, Mr. Felix?" the blonde asked sweetly. "Find another girl." He eyed the blonde, who wore a pink and white frangipani behind her ear that matched her pink lips. "Make one of the villas ready for me." She looked askance at Meyer. Meyer coughed and dropped his voice to a carrying whisper. "Mr. Felix owns the Hotel Heloise. Give him anything he wants." Heloise beamed. "Sure thing, Mr. Felix. What else would you like?" "I'm the activities manager, Mr. Felix," Hannah interjected. "My job is to make sure every guest enjoys his holiday to the fullest. Tell me what you want and I'll make it happen." His loins stirred at the thought. Who first, the blonde or the brunette? "Stand up," Jason ordered. "Both of you." Heloise rose and Jason eyed her breasts. More than a handful, much too big for his tastes. "Maybe some other time." He turned to scrutinize the brunette instead. Jason took stock of her athletic figure, perky breasts and rosebud mouth. She'd definitely do for a night. "Join me for a drink. I'd like to tell you what activities I have in mind." He crooked his finger and headed for the bar, grinning when he heard Hannah's following footsteps. Yes, he was still a rock star. No woman could resist him. 2. "I'm sending you to Australia," Phuong's father had told her. "There you can study accounting until you're qualified. A proper CPA. Then you will come home to sort out my company. You'll check all my accounts and find out who's stealing from me. I suspect my accountant, Felipe, but he's family, your brother's wife's brother, and your brother swears he's honest, so we need proof before we can fire Felipe and give you his job. So study hard, because this family's fortunes rest on you." "Why me? Why not Tuan?" Phuong asked. He sighed. "Because you're 10 times as clever as your brother, who's also blinded by love for the stupid woman he calls his wife. She'll spend all his money and leave him when he's bankrupt to marry some other stupid man. You'll never be seduced by a pair of batting eyelashes over a dissatisfied pout. Love won't make a fool of you." He was right, Phuong reflected. If she was ever foolish enough to fall in love, her mother's acid comments would soon dissuade her of any such sentimental feeling. Sadly, her father's plans hadn't come to fruition in his lifetime. A stroke felled him in his sleep, leaving her brother in charge of both the business and the family finances. Her brother's phone call had been abrupt. "I'm not wasting any more money on you. Felipe tells me Dad's business is nearly bankrupt, so we have to cut all unnecessary expenses, including educating you." "I don't know what Dad was thinking," Phuong said without even greeting her. "But I only have a year to go. Then I'll be able to work for Dad's firm and turn the company around just like he wanted," Phuong protested. "Just one more year." "Not 1 more cent," he snapped. "There's no point educating girls. Look at my wife Pearl. You might work for a few years but then you'll get married and have children. What do you need an education for when all you'll do is cooking, cleaning and childcare? And I won't support you anymore either. Pearl says we can barely afford to support Mother and we have nothing left to waste on you. You're too old. Find a job or a husband. You won't be welcome here." Before Phuong could respond, he'd hung up. That would be the last time she'd speak to her brother. Find a job or a husband. Her Australian visa didn't allow her to work more than 10 hours a week, which was hardly enough to pay for her final year of university fees. It would barely cover her food for the week, let alone her rent. She knew what she had to do: find a husband and fast. An Australian man who could give her Australian citizenship. Then she could finish her degree and save her father's firm. If Felipe and her brother hadn't bankrupted it already. A husband. She needed a husband. Where did a girl go to get a husband quickly? The internet, of course. She knew other girls back home who'd been mail-order brides and they'd raved about the experience. The men had romanced their brides-to-be, whisked them away to their home countries, married them and given them a future. She also knew girls back home who'd done worse, sold their bodies to many men, not just one, in order to help the family finances. Compared to prostitution, marriage to a stranger couldn't be that bad. Perhaps there'd be some handsome, charming, rich one who'd sweep her off her feet and into the lap of luxury. Then her brother would be begging her for favors. Smiling to herself, Phuong opened her laptop. She had a husband to find. 3. Hello? I need a fuck. Zan blinked and forced her smile to stay in place. I'm sorry, what did you say? I need a fuck. The frustrated-looking backpacker glared at her. And a plate. Zan repeated the man's accented English several times in her head, before she decided not to kick him in the groin for one of the coarsest come-on lines she'd ever been hit with. Instead she replied, you want a fork? It's a $10 deposit to get a crockery and cutlery pack, one of everything you need, including a plate and a fork. Here, let me show you. Zan rose and retrieved one of the drawstring bags from the office. She tipped it on the counter, sending a cascade of cutlery across the desk. $10 for a fuck? She had to keep a straight face. She had to. Zan took a deep, calming breath. Yes. It's a deposit. When you return this at the end of your stay, I'll give your $10 back. Zan watched the backpacker thinking it over. She could almost read his mind. Yes, $10 was cheap for what you got, but he didn't know if he could find the items cheaper in a discount store in town. If he did, he could return these and get his money back. But if he bought things, he'd never see that money back, even if he did get his $10 from her. He didn't have much space in his already overstuffed backpack because of all the souvenirs he wanted to take home. Maybe he'd just hand over the money and… Zan tried to hide her smile as he produced the cash. Here you go. She bagged the cutlery and passed the pack across the counter. Fresh off the plane, she was sure of it. If he'd stayed at any other hostels in Australia before coming to Broome, he'd know the drill by now. She watched him disappear through the swinging kitchen door, before he reappeared in a group of equally lost-looking girls by the communal refrigerator. He'd evidently been their spokesman, because the girls trooped out of the kitchen and laid siege to the reception desk. Zan did a quick head count and retrieved enough packs for everyone. She needn't have hurried though, the girls weren't familiar enough with Australian currency to produce a single $10 bill between them. She saw euros, ringgit and what looked like Thai baht surface, before they produced enough dollars to seal the deal. By the time the crowd cleared, the airport shuttle arrived, bringing with it a group of even more lost-looking souls, panting like dogs in the unfamiliar heat as they hefted their suitcases up the steps. Everyone wanted to visit a tropical paradise, but no one wanted to stay outside in the heat for long. Especially not in wet season humidity. "Excuse me, but where are the cups? I want to make a cup of tea, but I can't seem to find them." The wilting woman had arrived on yesterday's shuttle, but Zaan had been serving in the kiosk at the time, so one of the other girls had handled check-in. Zaan explained about the packs and endured a 10-minute argument as to why the woman couldn't just pay for the cup. It was the whole pack or nothing. It took another 5 minutes for the woman to produce the money she grumpily acknowledged was necessary, though she tried to tell Zaan she was $2 short while hiding the stack of 20s nestled in her wallet. A queue coughed and shuffled at the kiosk, but the two girls who took turns in the kitchen and manning the counter were nowhere to be seen. Sighing, Zaan stepped up to the counter and proceeded to sell soft drinks, laundry detergent and anything that could be deep-fried to the impatient guests. When the queue cleared, she took the food orders into the kitchen, where she found her missing staff peering at one girl's phone. "It sounds like a dream come true," the phone's owner breathed. "What was the girl's name?" "Heather, that was it." "I'd say it's more of a nightmare," Zaan interjected as she slapped the orders on the counter. All these people were waiting to be served, so hurry up and get the orders ready. "No, look at it, Zaan," Adele replied, pulling Heather's phone from her fingers and handing it to Zaan. "Seriously, it's got to be the best job in Broome. Tours and activities coordinator for the luxury resort island the celebrities go to. They want you to be a dive master, fluent in at least 2 languages and all sorts of things though. And a degree. But you get paid to snorkel and dive and go on helicopter tours all day, and you get to live on that island all the time." A luxury resort sure sounded better than watching backpackers count their pennies all day. Zaan hadn't thought she was ready for children, but now it seemed like she had hundreds of them. All adult-sized and asking the same questions, over and over and over again. Her visa would expire at the end of the dry season though, which meant she needed to return to the UK, her family and her fiancé. She missed Jerome like an ache in the, well, touring the world was one thing, but traveling celibate, knowing that he was counting on her coming home when he finished his studies so they could get married, get a house and do all the things newlyweds did? Sometimes it was enough to make her want to return early. Firmly stamp on what Jerome called her travel bug and settle down with him. For a moment, she considered it. A shrill scream broke through her reverie. Assuming the worst, Zaan took the stairs 2 at a time to the source of the sound, the female communal bathrooms. Damn! Why couldn't it be the male ones? "What's the problem?" she called as she strode in. Cries of "kicker" and "caddick" echoed through the steam, followed by, "What's a fucking frog doing in here?" "Ah." Zaan assumed her calm-the-mob tone. "Nothing to worry about. Just a frog. It can't hurt you. I'll get someone to catch it when we close the bathroom for cleaning in an hour. Welcome to Western Australia, where the wildlife's so friendly it joins you in the shower." One of the frog's friends snorted, but no one said anything else, so Zaan headed back downstairs to the reception desk. "Frog?" Adele asked as she handed a customer his change across the kiosk counter. "Frog?" No, she couldn't go home yet. She was having too much fun. She hoped the frog appeared in the men's bathrooms next, or one of the big bush spiders. It was shift change for the oil and gas platform workers tomorrow. Some of those guys were ripped. Maybe she should apply for that island resort job. How many dive masters with tourism degrees would there be around here? This was the trip of a lifetime, one big blast before she settled down for good with Jerome. It should include a piece of paradise. Go big or go home, she decided. And she wasn't ready to go home yet. Even if her life was all forks with no fucks. "Hi, I'm new here and I can't find any spoons in the kitchen." The nervous-looking girl stared pitifully at Zaan. "Please, can you tell me where to find them?" "There's a $10 deposit," Zaan began wearily. 4. Audra had never been so exhausted in her life, so naturally, she wanted to dance on the ceiling. She wasn't sure how many people had actually seen the South Pole, but now she was one of them. It felt exhilarating. Hence the need to dance as soon as she could shut the door of her tiny room, where no one would see. The buzzing in her blood was better than sex. Everyone had sex. Except her room wasn't hers. Well, it was, but it was someone else's too. The vacant bunk she'd considered her reading lounge was now occupied by a girl with a round, smiling face. Hi. Finally we meet. I'm Shelley. You must be Audra. The guys told me it's your first trip and you've already seen the pole. 3 winters I've spent here and my first expedition out there, I failed the medical and you got to go instead. I'm sure there'll be others. Some of the equipment wasn't up to spec, so when the right stuff arrives next summer, a team will need to return. Audra couldn't keep the longing out of her tone. Of course she wanted to be part of it. Who wouldn't? But she was only covering Shelley's maternity leave after all, and it looked like her time was up. How's your little girl anyway? Now it was Shelley's turn to look wistful. She said her first word the day before I left, Mum. It killed me to leave her, but Ross and I agreed that he'd get to be a stay-at-home dad with her while I went off to work. God, I hope he can handle it. She waved at their cramped room. This'll seem like a holiday in comparison though. They both laughed. Sorry, you probably want a minute to yourself after all that time in the field. Video calls home and such. I'll go take a shower before the boys use all the water. Shelley grabbed her towel and slung it over her shoulder. Watch out for the shower monitor. He's a big Russian bloke named Boris. If you try to take a shower even a second longer than 3 minutes, he'll bust in and carry you off for torture and whatever else Russians do to traitors. Apparently. Shelley's face fell. You mean Bruce left? He's the best plumber on the continent. Audra couldn't hide her smile. No, but he did spend a whole day booming at me in a thick Russian accent until one of the other guys ratted him out. I've never forgotten to time my showers since. Shelley laughed and headed for the showers. Alone, Audra decided dancing was probably a bad idea, so she dusted off her laptop and woke it up. Calling home could wait until tomorrow, but she could catch up on news and email in the meantime. Hundreds of unread emails awaited her, so she sighed and sat down to sort the spam from the 63 emails from Jay. More? She hadn't heard a peep from him since she left Romance Island, and she never expected to, either. Well, okay, for the first week she'd kind of hoped, and maybe for the second one too, especially after she'd sent him the photo of them together, and the third week. But by the time she'd boarded the Aurora Australis, she'd barely checked her email at all. And not because of the restricted internet access, either. So why on earth was he sending her thrice daily emails? Curiosity won, and she opened the most recent one. Why won't you answer my messages? Another. We were made for each other. Where are you? That popped up a lot, though the wording varied a bit, depending on the day. After the first couple dozen, Audra skimmed to the first one he'd sent. I'm home. Where are you, baby? Why aren't you here? Had he completely forgotten about her new job? The reason she was leaving the island? Maybe he was drunk. It still didn't explain why he thought she should be at the resort. Exasperated, Audra typed a response. I'm at Davis as one of the Antarctic meteorology team this summer. I just got back from an expedition to Dome Argus and the South Pole. It was awesome, thanks for asking. She hit send and scrolled through her emails, looking for anything from her family and friends. Her laptop chimed, signaling that someone wanted to start a video call. Jay, who else? She hadn't had a shower in days, and her hair had been mashed under an assortment of hats and hoods for weeks. One look at her would scare him off for life. Reluctantly, she allowed the call to connect. Where the fuck are you really? Jay Felix was all charm. Audra took a deep breath. She'd thought the soundproofing at the resort was bad. Here at Davis, if she raised her voice, the whole building would hear. Hi Jay. It's lovely to see you again. It's been months, I'm sure, though I gather you've been busy with your band's tour. I've been very busy too. First training for my first Antarctic expedition, and then living and working out here for the summer. There are real penguins here, not just a jetty named after one. I must say, the jetty smells better though. Why aren't you here? Judging by his slurred voice, sobriety had deserted him several hours ago. I don't work at Romance Island Resort anymore, remember? No. Was it because of me? Did you quit because of me? I told you I was coming back, babe. I own the hotel. Had to come back. He hadn't known? Then what had he meant that night when they'd? That last night we spent together. When you answered the door, you said I was just in time and I'd left it until the last minute. You knew it was my last day and I was flying out to Hobart on Monday. No, I fucking didn't. You never told me that. Audra mulled this over. So let me get this straight. You spent the night with me, made all sorts of promises you had no intention of keeping, then flew out the next morning to record your new album and go on tour. All the while, not saying a single thing to me. Not a word, a phone call, an email, nothing, until now, when you're demanding to know why I'm not waiting for you with open arms after you deserted me? I didn't desert you. I had to work. And who doesn't? When I got offered the chance of a lifetime, a stint in Antarctica, I took it. I'd have been crazy not to. Especially after dealing with VIPs who threw tantrums, painted the walls with ketchup, and slept with anything in a skirt. She'd never get the image of Jay and Penny out of her mind. It would scar her for life. Ooh, is that your boyfriend? Hi, I'm Shelley, Audra's roommate. Shelley smiled and waved over Audra's shoulder before throwing herself on her bed. Don't mind me. Yes, I'm Audra's, Jay began. Audra cut in, no, he's not my boyfriend. Never was, never will be. He used to be my boss. Though it was on the tip of her tongue, she didn't add that he'd once been the bane of her existence. It didn't seem fair to kick a man when he was down. What about all the time we spent together? Jay exploded. Are you honestly saying everything, the time, the incredible sex, meant nothing to you? Audra heard Shelley laugh softly, then whisper an apology. It was one night, Jay. One night that you made astonishingly clear meant nothing to you, when you climbed into a helicopter the morning after, then ignored me for months while wrapping yourself in different girls every night. Do you even remember how many? I mean, you did 20-30 shows at least, and I know for a fact that you took half a dozen girls back to your hotel room after the Perth concert. Add that all up and I don't need to be a statistician to know you've probably slept with over 100 women, while you didn't even have time to send me an email saying hi. She drew in a deep, shaky breath. If it weren't for the other girls, maybe I'd be interested if we were to meet again. But right now, if you showed up in the snow outside my door, I'd kick you right back to the boat that brought your sorry ass to Antarctica. His eyes got that kicked puppy look that a dog gets when. Audra had never kicked a puppy, but she figured hurt and betrayal and big wide eyes would feature in there somewhere. But I could fly there now. We can talk about this. I could take you home and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. How about it? A fresh start with just you and me. I'll marry you if that's what you want. No other women ever again. I swear. That same beseeching look she'd surrendered to before. Never again. Jay, you barely know me. Normal people don't marry strangers. Especially not strangers who've slept with 100 other people in less than 6 months. Please baby, give me time to book a flight and… Audra's heart nearly broke at the pain in his voice, but somehow she mentally sticky-taped it back together and said, no. I ship out in a couple of days. Even if you did fly here, I'd be gone, on my way back to Melbourne to finish my training. I told you before, if you want a girl to love you, you have to be more than a rock star. Go back to the hotel library and do some more research. You'll see what happens to guys who cheat. They don't get the girl, that's for sure. She sighed. I'm sure she's out there, Jay, the right girl for you. But I'm not her. So good night, and good luck." Before he could say anything, she ended the call and slammed her laptop closed. Shelley whispered, "Was that really Jay Felix?" Audra nodded. "And you used to work for him?" Another nod. Shelley cleared her throat. "He's always had a reputation for, well, you know. But I've always wondered if it was true or just something the girls made up. What's he like in bed?" In alarm, she added, "I'm only asking in the name of scientific inquiry, of course. Happily married and stored in this fridge and all." Audra smiled faintly. "Unbelievable." Shelley inhaled sharply. "I knew it." "Wait, in a good way or a bad way?" "Both." They both laughed, but Audra's heart wasn't in it anymore. Shelley was sensitive enough to stop. "He seems really into you despite all his obvious failings. Is there any chance you and him might, reconnect? In some way?" Audra shook her head. "If he grew up a bit and maybe turned into a good man instead of a spoiled, selfish asshole, maybe. But I think hell will freeze over first." She glanced out the window and noticed snow flurrying past the glass, dancing in an evening breeze that she'd never grow tired of watching. Unseen by anyone, her tears for Jay dropped onto the windowsill. 1, 2, 3, 4, the beats of a song that only her heart knew. 5. Jay lost count of the number of times he tried to call Audra again after the first call disconnected, but he just couldn't reach her. He couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. One moment he'd been thrilled to finally speak to her again, and the next, he was all at sea. She wanted to work in a frozen wasteland and she didn't want him? What was wrong with her? He'd have to talk to her in person, that was all. He'd find a plane or charter one to take him out there and… 2 hours later, he'd managed to find a cargo plane leaving New Zealand in a fortnight's time that would take him. Too late if Audra had been telling the truth, because she'd already be on the ship home. Maybe he could track her down in Melbourne, but he wouldn't know where to start looking. Besides, he wasn't a stalker, he stood out and was proud of it. And who was Audra anyway? Just a hotel maid turned weathergirl who'd saved his life and helped him and, fuck. He'd messed up again. Done something wrong and lost her for good this time. And there wasn't a thing he could do about it. At least, not yet. He needed to work out what he'd done wrong so it wouldn't happen again. Rock gods didn't get dumped, not even retired ones. Time to head back to the library. He'd get as many books as he could carry, and this time he'd pay attention. He'd get this romance thing sorted so no woman could resist him. So when the right one came along, she'd be his, no question. And no fuck-ups. The library was closed by the time he reached it, but he'd persuaded the security manager to give him access to more than what the regular guests got. He was the owner after all. After-hours access to the library? Easy. He headed straight for the shelf where the rockstar romances were kept. No matter what Audra said, he'd gotten some of his best ideas from these. As if someone had been expecting him, he found 3 new ones he'd never seen before, recognizable because of the absence of shirtless dudes on the cover, of course. He checked the bit on the back and they seemed sufficiently similar to the shirtless books to suit him. What else had she said? Something about marrying strangers. Those were the mail-order brides, weren't they? Funny, she'd admitted that she liked those books, and he'd even seen her reading a couple. He grabbed those too, figuring they might help. 5 books should do him for a couple of days, he decided, so he tucked them under his arm and left the library, whistling as he walked around the lagoon, back to his villa. 3 books and a lot of bourbon later, he discovered that he'd missed the first book in the series, so he staggered back there to find it. It figured, had a shirtless dude on the cover. No wonder he'd ignored it the first time. May as well get some more of the mail-order bride books too, to cover up the shirtless dude. He'd read it as soon as he got another bottle of bourbon. The last one had somehow emptied itself and he couldn't be fucked finding another one. Yeah. But now, he'd just rest his head on the rug for a moment. Because Jason's head touched the rug and he fell into a deep, whiskey-soaked sleep where he was a rock star again, and everything was rosy. Fuck yeah. 6. All out of fucks and forks to give, Zaan collapsed on her bed. Burying her face in her pillow, she tried to shut out the world, but she didn't have time for that yet. She had to call home. Easing her phone out of her bag, she checked that the Wi-Fi was active and started a video call to her parents. Her dad answered the call, peering blearily at the screen. Was it just Zaan's imagination, or was his nose red? Surely he couldn't be drunk at, she checked her watch, 10 in the morning. He rarely drank anything. Xanthi, is that you? You look so tanned. Hi Dad. Yeah, it's hard not to get tanned out here. The backpackers I manage is pretty open to the elements and it's only a short walk to Cable Beach, when I get time. They call it the wet season here, but we get fewer rainy days than you probably see. After chatting for a few minutes about life in Broome and some of the strange things Dad's English students had said lately, Zaan felt it was safe to ask, "Where's Mum?" Trying to single-handedly cure the plague, or that's what she says. I caught the dreaded lurgy from someone at work, so your mother's at the supermarket buying ingredients for soup. He sneezed, then finished with a hacking cough. Impressive, eh? Only her father could dramatize dying of man flu. Very. You make me really glad I'm on the other side of the world and it's summer here. She tried again. Just that Mum emailed me saying she needed to talk to me. It sounded ominous. You wouldn't know what she meant, would you? Her father shrugged. No idea. Maybe she just wants to give you the recipe for her plague-curing soup. It can't be that bad if I haven't heard anything, can it? Zaan finally relaxed. No, that's true. Maybe she wants me to send more Vegemite for your birthday. Her father failed to hide his horror. Oh God, please no. Don't send any more of that stuff. Do Aussies really eat that? How are any of them still alive? Zaan laughed. It's the best hangover cure ever, or so I've been told. I've never had so much to drink that I wanted to try it. Watching tourists try it for breakfast at the backpackers never gets old though. Their expressions, no words are necessary. So you like working there then? Thinking of extending your stay? Maybe. Zaan thought about leaving it at that, but she'd always told her father everything. I saw a better job advertised at a luxury resort near here. Well, a couple 100 kilometers from here actually, on an island. They're looking for someone to manage all the activities at the hotel. That includes diving and snorkeling. They've got some awesome coral reefs there that I'd kill to dive, but you can only get to them through the hotel because of the shape of the island. They cater to VIPs, so you have to factor in anything that's within reach of a helicopter, light plane or luxury yacht. And they have access to all three. The pay's good and it includes accommodation and board on the island, so I wouldn't have to share a house in town and pay rent either. Sounds perfect for you. That's what you want, right? All that time at university studying tourism management. I know we talked about history tours of the Greek islands, but with the economy the way it is, maybe you're better working in paradise in Australia. Perhaps one day I can persuade your mother to come for a visit. Zaan breathed a sigh of relief. She'd been thinking it, but to hear it from her father broke through all her remaining resistance. I'll put in my application tonight. A few minutes later, she ended the call and switched on her laptop. Yes, she wanted to do more diving before she settled down to a dull, married existence. 7. Pounding began in Jason's head. It wasn't until he cracked one eye open that he realized there was pounding outside it too. On the door. Fuck off, he mumbled. He reached across the bed, but there was nothing to grab but linen. Where were all the girls? He remembered 2, maybe 3 of them, but they weren't here now. That meant no one else would answer the door, and the hammering wouldn't stop until he did something about it. Yeah, coming, he growled. He reached the front door and waved it open. Mail delivery, Mr. Felix. The night porter waved at the box of fan mail, topped by a small stack of official-looking envelopes that he should probably read first. Jason kicked the box inside and grinned when it skidded on the polished tiles, spilling the stack of bills across the floor. White envelopes, white tiles, and one matte black envelope with the address printed on a sparkly silver label. He picked it up and flipped it over, wondering who'd died. It's not like he got funeral invitations very often. Maybe it was one of the Stones or some other rock royalty, acknowledging him as heir apparent to the title of the King of Rock, and begging him to attend the funeral of their old frontman and take his place in the band. He squinted at the address, struggling to focus on the ornate script. Miller. Who'd he know named Miller? At an address in Perth. Shrugging, Jason ripped it open and a shower of black glitter floated to the floor. The embossed card in his hand was an invitation, all right. To the wedding of Dr. Alana Angel Miller and, fuck. He threw it on the floor, wanting to stomp it into the tiles. Angel was marrying the crazed stalker? The psycho who'd nearly killed her, then tried to beat Jason up too, when he came to visit her in hospital? Ignoring his splitting headache, he marched to find his phone. Without hesitating, he punched his sister's number and leaned against the kitchen bench while the call trilled for her to answer. Pick up. She had to. Hi Jason. This really isn't a good time. What the fuck is this? Is she fucking crazy? He interrupted. He should be locked up and not allowed near her. She should be committed to a mental hospital. Fucking insane. Right, 1 second. I told my boss it's a family emergency and, seeing as the whole room heard you, I think he'll believe anything, provided I get your profanity the hell out of his meeting. I take it you got the invitation? The faint sound of a door closing came down the phone line. Okay Jason. I'm back in my office and I've closed the door so everyone in the building doesn't have to listen to you swearing. She said she wanted to invite you and I gave her your address. Then she knew he hadn't left the state. She knew where he was. Fuck, did that mean tomorrow she'd be on his doorstep, knife in hand? She said she'd castrate me, Joe. Cut my fucking balls off. What part of that didn't you believe? You're the one who keeps telling me to stay away from her. She carries that knife with her everywhere. And you told her where I live? Shouting hurt his head, but he couldn't seem to turn down the volume on his own voice. She didn't really mean it, Joe soothed. She was angry. You'd set some security guard to stalk her without telling her. You scared her. She wasn't fucking scared. Do you know what she did to the guy? Her and that steroid-enhanced psycho she thinks she's going to marry? She stabbed him. Fucking stabbed him. Then tied him up with electrical tape and tortured him until he told her everything. In her own apartment. Jay hadn't slept for 3 days after he'd heard that, certain he'd be next. If Angel didn't hunt him down, she'd send the psycho instead, and that guy liked inflicting pain. Just look at what he did to her. She can't marry him. She just fucking can't. Joe sighed. She can and she will, Jason. Look, I don't like him either, but she can take care of herself. We're not teenagers anymore. Even before Chaya made the charts, she had the money to hire security to watch her 24/7. Trevor says he's not a threat and he'd know. He saw combat in Afghanistan, for God's sake. You're just jealous. No, I'm not. The words escaped before Jason could stop them. Fuck, he sounded like a whiny 5-year-old instead of a rock god. Jason. You're my brother and I know you. You've always had a thing for her. A thing. She made it sound like something small and squeaky that hid under the bed at the first sign of danger. He didn't have a thing for her. It was full-blown love and had been since primary school. Since the first day Joe invited her to sit with them at choir practice. He'd lost his soul in the depths of her dark eyes that day. She'd never fucking noticed though. Even when Chaya hit it big, she hadn't treated him like a rock god. He was just Jason, who forgot the words and drank too much and was never on time to rehearsals. Who ignored a rock god? Who fucking dared? I'm not going. No fucking way. If he had to watch Angel walk down the aisle to marry another man, he'd cry. He'd be on the front of every damn newspaper in the world with the headline "J. Felix is a pussy," because the woman he'd always loved threw him away for a muscle-bound psycho. You have to, Jay. Even if it breaks your heart to do it, she wants you there. What will the reporters say if you don't show up? There won't be any. She doesn't give interviews and doesn't let any of them into her life. Jason tried to make it sound certain, but he wasn't. People took photos at weddings and all it took was one leak to the press. Weddings were easy to crash, he'd even done it once or twice. You know there will be. A Chaya wedding means all of us. Grow a pair, put on a tie, and be there to support her. God knows how much she's done for you over the years. Jason tried not to think about it. Every mess he'd gotten into, she'd seen it. Or most of them at least. Those accusing eyes as she shook her head, disappointed again. Every time he got drunk or the rare occasions he'd tried something stronger, trust a med student to know exactly what every illegal drug did to his body, plus describe what happened when people overdosed. She'd treated enough cases when she did her emergency department rotations. She had a rock god terrified to take drugs because nothing ruined his high like a fear of certain death. And the loss of his recording contract, she'd threatened that too if he couldn't pass a drug test. I'm busy. I can't go because I already have plans. Joe snorted. Bullshit. You don't have any plans for the rest of this week, let alone the rest of the year. You'll have to find a better excuse than that. He stared at the invitation. The wedding was a whole year away at some beach resort in the southwest. Wasn't that where her body had been dumped? When she'd been kidnapped and nearly died. No wonder the invitation resembled a funeral notice. Dark like her stage name, Angel Black. Another name caught his eye. Well, not really a name. It was the absence of a name beside his. She requested the company of Jason Felix and partner. Now that was a low blow, when she knew damn well she was the only life partner he'd ever dreamed about. Oh, sure, there'd been other girls he'd considered, but only briefly. He shoved Audra out of his mind. Angel. Always it came back to her. So I'll tell her you'll be there? Joe ventured. Come on, Jason. It's time to grow up and face facts. She's just not that into you. You'd both be better off with other people. No. Not before hell froze over and pigs flew and he put a gun to his head. Except he didn't want to die. Maybe she did. Maybe she'd taken the whole gothic costume to heart and now she wanted to die young. The ultimate tragedy. Maybe it was time to face facts. If she married that psycho, he'd kill her for sure. But Jason didn't intend to settle for sloppy seconds if she survived. No, that ship had sailed. If Angel wanted to make her own bad decision, fuck her. Or not. He could get any girl he wanted and he'd prove it too. By the time he turned up at her wedding, he'd be deliriously happy with his own partner, who he'd introduced to the ball-breaking bride on her wedding day. Sure. I'll be there. With a partner too. Silence. Joe sucked in a breath. Jason, if you bring some fangirl to the wedding who blows you under the table like you did at Sheila's wedding, she won't laugh it off. She's got family coming over from the Middle East for the wedding. If you embarrass her like that, shit Jason, you're asking to get killed. No, he didn't want some fangirl this time. She'd see through that as the passing fancy it was. Don't be stupid. If she wants me at her wedding with my partner, then that's what she'll get. Not some fangirl. I'll be bringing my wife. Jason, tell me you haven't done anything stupid. He grinned. Stupid is for rockstars. I'm a hotel manager now, or something like that. All respectable and shit. I should cut my hair and wear a shirt maybe. But the hotel maids like it when I don't, so only occasionally. Oh Jason, you didn't marry one of the hotel staff. Not that poor hotel maid. Please? The mention of Audra twisted the knife in his heart even deeper. Fuck her. Fuck them all. Not a maid. No fucking way. I'm going to find a girl, make her madly in love with me, and we'll get married. All happily ever after and shit. Like a movie. Or the book I was reading last night. What book? A romance book Jason didn't feel like discussing with anyone right now. She'd say he was stupid. He pressed his lips together. Jason, no one marries a stranger and expects to be happy. That sort of thing only happens in fairy tales and romance novels. Not to real people. No one believes in happy endings anymore. You'll see. My wife and me will be so fucking happy, we'll stick the wedding couple in the shade. Tell her that, Joe. He ended the call and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. A wife. One who wasn't a fangirl. He'd need a foreigner who had no idea who he was. One who didn't know his name but who believed in fairy tales. Where the fuck was he going to find one of those? 8. Are you an Australian citizen? This interview question was the kicker, Zaan knew. No matter how qualified she was, wording this wrong could cost her a dream job. She couldn't wait to see the resort. Not for the first time, she wished the interviews had been conducted on the island, instead of at one of the hotels in town. No. I'm on a working holiday visa that expires at the end of the year. I've travelled around Australia, working the peak season at several resorts on the east coast before taking the train across the country to Western Australia, where my journey brought me here to Broome. I was lucky enough to find a position that kept me here during the low season, and I want to extend my stay for as long as possible. It's the sort of place you see in pictures and can't believe is real until you see the colours for yourself. Now, I don't want to leave. So you would consider extending your visa in order to stay here? Max Meyer asked, his voice so calm he sounded bored. From the way his whitened knuckles clutched the pen, Zaan speculated that the answer to this meant far more to him than he was willing to admit. I would consider it, yes, Zaan replied. Triumph flashed in his eyes before it vanished. Zaan hid her smile. The job was hers. She knew it. Romance Island Resort has an international clientele. I believe you mentioned experience in languages other than English? Boredom had returned. After managing Broome backpackers for the last 5 months, I believe I understand common phrases from more than 50 languages. When Maya's eyes widened in admiration, she delivered her punchline, especially, bloody hell, there's a frog in my bathroom, though the swearing varies in intensity depending on the time of day and the state of undress of the guest. Maya laughed. So you're fluent in English, Greek, Latin and French. Not that she expected to use the Greek or Latin her father had taught her, but it sounded good. Best not to mention it was ancient and not modern Greek too. We get a lot of guests from Asia, so it's important that Kingwa Katik Dadura. My pronunciation isn't perfect, I know, but that's frog in Chinese, Indonesian and Malay and Hindi, I think. It's best that I don't share the swearing. Zaan smiled sweetly. I learn fast. The interview wound down with a smattering of small talk and what Zaan thought was a heartfelt handshake, at least on Maya's part. Was it her imagination, or did he seem particularly desperate to fill this position? She strode out of the Mangrove Hotel meeting room, feeling more than a little smug. With the interview over, the afternoon spread out before her like a warm towel at the beach. Except, all suited up as she was in this heat, a dip in the warm water of Roebuck Bay didn't appeal as much as it should. Better would be an ice-cold beer from the brewery. Zaan turned her back on Town Beach and the hotel, where the next nervous-looking candidate had just met Max Meyer. A cold pint, a late lunch and a relaxing afternoon was what she deserved. Kathy recognized her the moment she walked through the door, despite the suit, and Zaan returned her friendly nod as she seated herself at a tiny table directly below one of the whirring fans. Zaan didn't need to do more than glance at the menu before Kathy stood at her side, order pad at the ready. Same as usual? Of course. Zaan scanned the menu. And the con-carne. I haven't had lunch yet. Popular choice today. I'll see if we have any left. Kathy returned with Zaan's usual pint of ginger beer, alcoholic of course, none of that kid stuff. She confirmed that the kitchen could fill her lunch order before bustling up to deal with a group of wide-eyed tourists, who stared avidly around as if they'd never seen old pearling memorabilia before. Perhaps they hadn't. After all, if the Backpackers was busy, the other hotels in town had to be too. So many new arrivals. Zan had stared at the old black-and-white photos on the walls too, on her first time here. The old sign from when the brewery had been a general store still hung over the bar, though the store had stopped trading decades ago, or that's what the tour guide said. She'd been the only one staring at the walls that day. Everyone else had been transfixed by some celebrity who'd turned up and decided to treat his adoring fans. Some famous musician or other. She'd caught a glimpse of him. She wasn't sure what had irritated her the most, his arrogance or the sleazy way he'd surveyed his newfound harem. When she'd left that day, his party was well underway. She wondered which of the girls had been with him for more than a free meal. He'd evidently expected repayment for his largesse. God, men like that were everywhere. Luckily, she hadn't seen him again. Broom was better off without him. Zan laughed quietly to herself. She'd only lived in the town for a few months, and she was already as protective of it as a local. That's what this new job was all about though, another reason for her to want to stay. She'd get to see even more of the surrounding countryside and ocean if she got the job at Romance Island Resort as she guided VIPs around. Helicopters and yachts and diving every day. She wouldn't want to give it up. That's what Jerome was for, to tempt her home when her working holiday got too good. 9. What are you trying to do, kill me? Norman's whining voice set her teeth on edge. Don't tempt me, Phuong thought, setting down the cooking oil. She glanced at the cutting board, where a suitable blade sat between the chopped meat and vegetables she planned to stir-fry for dinner. First all this weird Asian food with rice and now peanut oil? Don't you know I'm allergic to peanuts? If I didn't know better, I'd say you don't want to be my wife. Where are the potatoes? Steak? Real food that normal people have? Didn't your mum teach you to cook properly back home in Bangkok, Fiona? In Singapore, they'd had a cook, just like in the residential college dorm she'd lived in until she'd moved in with Norman a month ago. But she bit her tongue instead of correcting him. She'd grown resigned to letting him anglicize her name to Fiona, instead of mangling her real one. Phuong arranged her expression in what she hoped was an apologetic smile. No, sorry. His fist slammed into the counter, making her jump. Then fucking learn. You want to earn your keep and stay here, learn to cook real food. Inwardly seething, Phuong lowered her eyes as she nodded. This was what she got, looking for a husband on a mail-order bride website. The sort who couldn't get a girl any other way. She'd leave him the moment she got her citizenship, she promised herself. In the meantime, she just had to put up with him. So what's for dinner tonight? He demanded. A nasty glint in his eye warned her that this wasn't over. Pork stir-fry with? No more fucking Asian rabbit food. I want steak or a roast. Phuong moved to the freezer, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the door and peered inside. We don't have any. I'll have to do some shopping and we can have steak tomorrow. With fucking potatoes. And mushy peas. He scrunched his eyebrows fiercely so they met over his nose. You'll order the shopping online tonight to be delivered tomorrow when I get home. Phuong forced out another smile and a nod. I'll order pizza tonight, but I won't be so lenient next time. When I get off the phone, I expect you in the bedroom. Ready for me. With numb fingers, Phuong untied her apron and headed for the dreaded bedroom. Hours later, when Norman's beer-fueled snoring told her that the ordeal was over for the night, Phuong pressed her thighs together to still the aching between them from Norman's rough lovemaking. There was no love in it, or even desire on her part. He disgusted her, but she didn't dare say so. She got free rent and board, and this was his price. She threw the bedclothes off and padded to the apartment's tiny living area. Her laptop still sat on the table from submitting the grocery order, so she flicked it on again and watched the screen glow to life. Like she had almost every evening since moving in with Norman, Phuong logged on to the mail-order bride website where she'd first corresponded with him. He'd been the first to respond to her ad, and she'd seized the opportunity to live with a man who promised to take care of her, so she'd never need to work a day in her life. She hadn't expected to be locked in his apartment, cooking and cleaning, until he returned from work to use her body as if she were a prostitute. If only she'd known that he spent most of his annual vacation time in places like Bangkok, banging prostitutes who didn't require him to be anything more than a paying customer. No wonder he didn't know how to treat a woman. The only excitement she felt in the bedroom was when he was done or if he started snoring, so she could retreat to the shower and scrub the feel of his touch off her skin. Men with six-packs who treated women like princesses didn't need to find a bride on the internet. She'd known that, but every day with Norman was more of a struggle. Not for the first time, she considered doing what her school friend's sister had to pay her way through university. Lynn had paid for her board and nursing degree by performing cash-in-hand prostitution work for patients and staff in the hospitals where she did her practical placements. No, she couldn't. Letting one man use her body was bad enough. Taking all comers, she'd scrub her skin raw after every one. Resolutely, she opened the message page for the dating site where she'd kept every one of Norman's messages of love and devotion. Lies she knew now, but so were all fairy tales. This was the quickest way to achieve her end, to become an Australian citizen, then get an interest-free government loan for the final year of her degree at a third the price she'd pay as a Singaporean citizen. Today, Norman's saccharine sweet words didn't soothe her the way they used to. Perhaps because she recognized their falseness. Idly, she clicked on one of the unread messages from some other man whose profile was a sculpted, headless torso, like something cropped from the cover of a romance novel. Not that she could read those much with Norman around, she kept the extensive library of e-books on her phone a carefully hidden secret. Norman might explode with rage if he knew other men were better at sex than he was, or that women actually enjoyed it. He made cavemen look enlightened. Mr. Sixpack's message was short. I'm looking for a woman who knows all fairy tales are lies but who still hopes one might come true. Reflexively, Phuong clicked on his profile. Mr. Sixpack was a gym junkie, he admitted, who went by the name of Lucky Jason. He worked on a remote island, but it was lonely and he wanted to share his living accommodation with someone who could brighten the darkness at night. Or so he said. She laughed softly before clapping a hand over her mouth at the thought that she might wake Norman. His snores continued, like he was sawing down a tree with his nose in his sleep, so she breathed a sigh of relief and returned to ogling Jason's abs. Desire flooded her for the first time in months. If only she'd received his message before Norman's, maybe she'd be stroking those muscles in bed right now. She hit the reply button. Which fairy tale did you have in mind, and which character are you? The Big Bad Wolf, the Woodcutter, or Prince Charming? Before she could think better of it, she sent the message. The response came back almost instantly. What would you like me to be? I can cut down everyone keeping you from me, carry you off to my castle like Prince Charming, then turn into the Big Bad Wolf and eat you all up until you scream for joy. That only happens in books, she whispered to herself, then typed the words and fired them off. Lucky Jason had an answer for that too. One day, some romance author will write books about us and a million lonely women will crave the sort of sex you only have to ask for. Arrogant much? No one's that good. What if I'm after Prince Charming, a man who loves me, listens to me and wants to take care of me, and I'm not interested in sex? Prince Charming is a prick who'll smother you and turn jealous if you look at anyone else. He'll lock you in a tower and never let you out. And he wouldn't know what to do with his own cock, let alone your body. Prince, where do I put my prick? That's not me, babe. But it was Norman. No? You don't get jealous? What do you do when your girl looks at another man? Grin and wink at the guy while my arm's around her. He'll never be me and never have what I do, but that's cool. Not everyone's as awesome as me. Let me show you, babe. She gasped at his audacity, the sheer arrogance of the man, but even the typed words made her more aroused than Norman ever had. Aroused at a man who used a stock photo for a profile picture. Show me what you really look like first. What do you mean? The site's rules say no face, cock or ass pictures, so I stuck my six-pack on there. You don't like muscles, babe? They don't look real. Show me what you really look like. She slowly exhaled, knowing she'd effectively ended the conversation. Lucky Jason's six-pack was as fictional as his sexual prowess. Big bad wolf eating her indeed. She left the laptop and headed to the kitchen to dry the dishes. Lucky Jason wasn't so lucky tonight, but then neither was she. Phuong returned to the laptop when she'd put away the last beer glass. To her surprise, a blurry picture of a man's muscled tummy beside the edge of a keyboard sat on the screen. "Satisfied?" said the message above it. "No," she replied. "You could have pulled that photo off the internet too. Give me proof of life. Take a picture with today's newspaper." "We don't get newspapers out here. I live on a deserted island. Tell me your real name and I'll write it across my abs for you." If he mangled her name or called her Fiona like Norman, she'd delete every damn message and never speak to him again. "It's Phuong." Seconds ticked by without a response. Phuong glanced at the clock on the oven. If she didn't go to bed soon, she wouldn't get enough sleep before Norman insisted she make breakfast for him. She glanced back and was greeted by another blurry picture, but this one had the letters PHU wavering across his skin. She held her breath as another picture appeared, this time bearing a wonky O, a back-to-front N and a tailed G that ended by guiding her eye to the treasure trail vanishing into the waistband of his shorts. Then a final shot with all 6 letters. Before she could type a response, he added a line of text, "How do you pronounce it?" "Rhymes with thong, only with an F, wonders never ceased." A second point to Lucky Jason, one for actually having a six-pack, and one for caring about getting her name right. "I want to see you wearing one so I can take it off with my teeth." That made him an American, Phuong guessed, sighing. Lucky Jason was too good to be true. He couldn't give her Aussie citizenship, so she'd be stuck with Norman. "Just don't bite my feet. I'm looking for an Australian man who knows thongs come in pairs and who'll wear them with me as we go for a walk on the beach. Is there one of those on your deserted island?" "Don't think so." She switched her computer off and put it away, wishing for just a moment she'd waited for someone like Jason instead of settling for neurotic Norman. Squeezing into the apartment's only bed beside Norman, she dreamed of something better. Someone better. Hoping that one day she'd be free to choose. 10. Her day had to get better. It had to. Oh, in God's name, what was that racket? The long loud note of someone pressing the shit out of their horn made Zan stick her head out of the office. A guest had almost reversed his hire car into the drinks truck. Instead of attempting to maneuver around the truck, or waiting for the driver to finish his delivery, the idiot punched his car horn again and started swearing at the driver to move. Zan scanned the parking lot, but the foul-mouthed guest was the only person there. She found the truck driver in the kitchen, lifting boxes onto the counter for Adele. Every time his biceps flexed, Adele cooed over them. "What's happening out there?" the delivery guy asked. "Someone nearly crashed into your truck and for some reason this upset him, so he's blaming you for it." Zan shrugged. "Let him wait. The only cars that can't get out of that parking lot are the staff ones you're parked in front of, and we won't need them until Adele finishes work in an hour." Adele flashed a grateful smile. "Only an hour to go?" "Same as me," the driver drawled, eyeing Adele. Zan returned to the office and month-end reports. This would go so much faster if Emily hadn't messed up the data entry on all the invoices. Tomorrow, she'd have to sit the girl down and explain it again. But right now, the fastest way to fix this was to redo it all herself. One invoice at a time. If only she'd gotten that resort job. It had been 3 weeks since her interview and she hadn't heard anything, though they'd said she'd know within a week. That meant a rejection letter, she was sure of it. They'd probably found some Aussie who'd grown up bilingual, speaking Chinese or whatever they needed their tour guide to talk in. If she'd known she'd need Chinese, she'd have dropped French and picked up the new language in a heartbeat, way back in high school. Even the memory of her French teacher's expression as Zan mauled the woman's native tongue was enough to make her wish she'd had another option. Invoices. Zan forced herself to think of invoices and not what might have been. Her bad luck now would surely lead to an awesome opportunity soon enough. Something always came up. 6 corrections later, her phone buzzed. Zan didn't recognize the number, aside from knowing it was a Broome landline, so she answered cautiously, "Hi, this is Zan." "Ms. Lane? It's Max Meyer, the manager here at the Romance Island Resort. Sorry it's taken so much time to get back to you, but it's taken this long to clarify matters with the Department of Immigration. They can't extend a visa like yours, but they can transition it into a skilled migrant visa with a view to." He continued, but Zan only half listened to jargon, numbers and a boring story about bureaucracy. What did it matter? He'd evidently given the job to someone else. If this was his rambling way of justifying it, she'd have preferred the stock standard rejection letter in the post, "Thank you." It was far more satisfying to shred the letter into little pieces, than to listen politely to someone deliver the same message, until she could bite out a false but cheerful farewell. A string of words caught her attention. "Wait, what?" "I said we can only offer you the job if you're willing to commit to at least a full year, with the possibility of extending your contract over the next 3 years after that." Maya sucked in a breath. "But if you cease working with us, you'll have 2 weeks to leave the country and the resort will pay for your flights." He wasn't rejecting her? But a year, or even 4 of them, she'd have to talk to her parents. Not to mention Jerome. If she lived here that long, maybe she'd never want to leave. Of course, the resort job could suck donkey's balls and maybe she'd want to leave after a week. Unlikely, but possible. If that happened, she'd be back on a plane to the UK earlier than she'd intended. But the resort would pay for it. "Ms. Lane? Sorry." The possibilities kept multiplying before her eyes. "I'm at work at the moment, so I can't really discuss this here. Can you send those contracts through so I can take a look at them? I should be able to give you an answer tomorrow." "There's the visa documents too. Quite a lot of paperwork. We'd need all of it filled in as soon as possible, as the visa application takes some time and you can't start work until it's approved." Which bit of "I'm at work and can't discuss this" did he not understand? Zan wasn't sure she wanted to work for a demanding boss who ignored any kind of professional ethics. Plus, if she didn't get along with him the moment she quit, she'd be shipped back to the UK on the next plane. End of adventure. Movement caught her eye and Zan couldn't help staring as a man wearing nothing but a towel that barely met around his hips strode across the courtyard toward her. She had to get off the phone now. Drooling was imminent. "I understand. I'll get back to you tomorrow." Before Maya could say anything else, she ended the call. "Yes? Can I help you?" Zan addressed the six-pack rapidly approaching before lifting her gaze over his defined chest, to his thunderous expression. "I found this in the shower," he grumbled, opening one fist. Zan caught a glimpse of green before the frog made a flying leap for freedom. Taut and toweled launched himself into the air after the miscreant, throwing both arms up to catch it. The towel flew apart like the wings of an angel, displaying everything he had to offer his future bride. Zan didn't need a camera to remember this. The image of his flying wedding tackle was burned into her retinas. The rest of him wasn't half bad either. And he caught frogs naked, quite an achievement, though one he didn't seem particularly proud of. Flying Frogman dove for his towel and wrapped it around his hips once more, mumbling something as he hurried back to the bathroom. And that was why Zan had chosen to work in a backpacker's hostel. Every day had new surprises in store. Even she hadn't guessed that today would include the best flying tackle she'd ever seen, and a job offer. What else would the day hold? Her chiming computer brought her thoughts back to the present. Sighing, Zan returned to the monthly accounts. The sooner she was finished, the sooner she could open the email from Maya that had just popped up in her inbox. Zan wasn't sure whether to buy celebratory champagne or bugger the whole bloody world bourbon on her way home. Maybe both. She'd decide what to drink once she'd read Maya's email. It's not like alcohol went to waste at her place. Today might not be a bourbon day, but tomorrow might deserve a double. 11. If she'd been a bourbon drinker, Phuong would have downed a whole bottle happily. As it was, they only had beer and it wasn't exactly a breakfast food. Phuong had managed to stay away from her messages for 35 hours, until Norman had insisted on pancakes for breakfast. "You're useless in the kitchen. These are nothing like my mum used to make. These aren't fit for dogs." Norman shook the offending pancake in her face before dropping it in the bin. It didn't matter that every other identical pancake she'd made had been eaten with grunts of what she'd assumed were approval. Today, they weren't good enough. "You better not mess up dinner or I'll throw you out of the house and find someone better." He closed the door behind him and ground the key in the deadlock, effectively imprisoning her in the third-floor apartment. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thought that she'd endured a month of this torture without a thing to show for it. Still, she was no closer to getting her citizenship or finishing her degree. Phuong grabbed her laptop and gripped the keyboard as she waited for it to power up. This time, she didn't even glance at Norman's messages. Her eyes darted to the new message waiting from Lucky Jason. Whispering a prayer, she clicked on it. She gasped at the gallery of photos Jason had sent her. A weird angled shot, showing his abs and his shorts in the blurred foreground as the picture focused on his thong-clad feet on the sand. In the second picture, he held out a pair of pink ladies' thongs with a long sandy beach in the background. Phuong scrolled down, only to discover he'd taken the shoes to half a dozen picturesque spots and photographed each one. A jetty, a tiny beach beneath rust-colored cliffs, palm trees caressing white sand, his feet knee-deep in water, with what looked like baby sharks swimming around his legs, with a final shot of the sunset framed between the same pair of women's footwear. He'd only written one line to go with them: "I'm looking for a woman who can fill these shoes." She laughed at the Cinderella reference, knowing that no self-respecting fairy godmother would grant a girl rubber-soled thongs. Jason and his talk of fairy tales. "Where on earth do you live?" Phuong fired back, wiping her tears away. Jason lived in paradise. He'd surely have his pick of beautiful women there. But there was no response. He wasn't online, or he wasn't listening. Phuong decided to work off her frustration by doing the things she hated most. She scrubbed the bathroom, cleaned the toilet, mopped all the tiles and vacuumed every bit of the floor, checking her laptop as she passed, hoping for an answer that never came. She vacuumed mummified fly corpses out of the sliding door tracks and window frames, emptied the kitchen cabinets, wiped them down and replaced everything. Jason had vanished off the face of the earth, if he even existed. Phuong loaded a piece of pork into the roasting pan, obeying the instructions on the packaging, as she set the temperature and timer. Whatever she did to the meat, it wouldn't satisfy Norman, but he'd at least be mercifully silent for the few minutes he had his mouth full. Grabbing a handful of sugar snap peas from the fridge, she sat in front of her laptop as she crunched through her snack. As if he'd sensed her presence, a new message from Jason popped up on the screen. 8 words: Romance Island Resort. The loneliest island on Earth. A resort? Phuong snorted. He'd have women hanging off him at every turn. If there was such a place. A quick search revealed that the island did exist, and some of the pictures on the resort's website resembled those Jason had sent her. "What's wrong with you that you can't get a date on Romance Island?" she typed. There. Now it had come out. Maybe his face was horribly disfigured and no one could look at him. Maybe he'd suffered a horrific accident so he couldn't see, hear or speak. "I can get a date or a one-night stand or a holiday romance from almost any woman who sets foot on the island. They can't resist me. But love, commitment? No one wants that anymore. They just want what I can do for them and they're gone, taking a piece of my heart with them." "That's not true," she began, then hesitated. She wasn't looking for love or long-term commitment, just what an Australian man could give her to further her career. Was she so different? It's not like she'd looked for love from Norman. She wanted to be free of him as soon as possible. Erasing her first line, she replaced it with, "You must have known some really horrible, mercenary women." As if by magic, she'd unleashed the floodgates. Jason's responses flowed thick and fast, relating years of pain at casual relationships that never lasted. Women who weren't enough for him, who wanted to drain him dry and leave him a lifeless husk. Like Norman was doing to her. The scrape of booted feet on the doormat sent Phuong into a panic. She'd lost track of the time, and Norman was home already. She hadn't even prepared the vegetables. Slamming her laptop shut, she stowed it in the bag and hurried to the kitchen. Norman could never know she'd been talking to another man. He'd go ballistic and try to take her laptop away from her. She couldn't allow that to happen. Jason was the only thing keeping her sane. And maybe, just maybe, she could help him too. 12. Zhan skimmed through the documents as she ate her dinner alone at home that evening. The Chinese takeaway did the best roast pork, and she decided to treat herself tonight. The more she read, the more she became convinced that she'd been offered her dream job. Nevertheless, she couldn't accept it without speaking to her family and, more importantly, Jerome. He hadn't replied to her emails in a while, and she'd been so busy with work that she'd been too tired to call him most nights. But this was important. She'd track him down by dawn if it killed her. Who to call first? Her parents would be easy. They supported her in everything she did, but she didn't want to tell them about the new job if Jerome didn't want her to take it. Better that they never knew about it at all. She tried Jerome but got no answer, so she left him a short voicemail asking him to call her as soon as he received her message, or tell her when to call back. Fine. Her parents it would be then. Finally. Mum huffed before even bothering with a hello. I thought you'd forgotten all about us. Having so much fun in Australia that you forgot about the people who love and care for you here at home? Despite herself, Zhan laughed. Yeah, Mum. Doing the monthly accounts for a backpacker hostel in between rescuing the tourists from the resident wildlife is so thrilling. I've started applying for other jobs to save myself. Wildlife? What kind of wildlife? Her mother turned pale. Tell me you're not catching snakes and other dangerous things, turning into something like that crazy crocodile man. He died, you know. No, Mum, I haven't caught a single crocodile, though I heard one might have moved into the mangroves near Streeter's jetty in town. I heard it from one of the tour guides who saw the tracks. More likely kids with dirt bikes, but you never know. I'm sure I've told you about the frogs in the bathrooms at the backpackers. Zhan didn't have to force a smile. Flying Frogman was her favorite guest this week, hands down. What kind of hotel has frogs in the bathroom? It sounds like a dive, Xanthi, honey. With all your qualifications and things, surely you can get a better job in a place without vermin. Mum gave her the best openings. Actually, I received a job offer this morning. A luxury resort on its own island just north of here wants me to work for them, organizing activities for their celebrity guests and stuff. It looks really good, but they want me to stay longer than I'd planned. Definitely past Christmas. Maybe even longer than that. Really? Mum peered at the screen as if trying to search Zhan's expression through the thousands of miles separating them. Are you sure that's what you want? We love you and we'd love to have you home for Christmas, of course, but it seems like you've already given up so much for your trip. A good job at the school where your father teaches, your lovely flat, and that boyfriend of yours. Is living in Australia really worth giving up all of that? The flat hadn't been lovely at all. It had been tiny, with walls so thin you heard what the neighbors were watching on TV or, worse, what noises they made in bed. Teaching English was hardly her dream job, and Jerome, she hadn't given him up at all. They were engaged and the wedding would happen when she got back. But I suppose that wasn't as hard as I expected. Zhan shook herself out of her meandering thoughts as she realized her mother was still rambling. Is he the reason you've moved to Australia? Mum finished plaintively. Is who? And I haven't moved to Australia. I'm just here on a working holiday, a bit of a break after finishing university before. That half-wit ex-boyfriend of yours. He should have fought harder to make you stay, but it's his loss. Had her mother been drinking? Surely she remembered the fancy family dinner where Zhan and Jerome had announced their engagement. Zhan hadn't taken the ring off since. Mum. You deserve better. Maybe you can find some rugged Australian man while you're over there. That's why you broke it off with that boy here, didn't you? You knew what he was like and didn't want a bar of it. I always knew he was bad news. Mum. What are you talking about? Since when is Jerome bad news? Zhan wanted to reach through the screen and shake her mother. None of this made sense. Since he got little Kelly from up the road pregnant, he's going to marry her too when she'd old enough, so now she's proudly walking up and down the street in all weather just so everyone can see her ring resting on that swelling belly of hers. Kelly? Zan racked her brain for anyone they knew by that name. There was that kid up the road she used to babysit on occasion, but she was only a teenager, barely into high school. Which Kelly, Mum? The one I'm thinking of is only 14. Jerome knew her because he babysat with me a few times or picked me up from there when it was too late to walk, but he couldn't. He couldn't have a baby with some kid when he was meant to marry me, was what Zan wanted to say, but the words stuck in her throat. She's 16 now. You've been away for a while, Xanthi. After you broke up with him, that boy must have moved on right away. He always did want a wife and kids. Guess he got both in one hit. You did good when you broke up with him. I always knew there was something off about him. Zan lost track of her mother's words again, but this time she didn't care. 26-year-old Jerome having a baby with Kelly, who was still a kid in school herself? He couldn't. The diamond ring on her finger blurred in the onslaught of tears. Tears she couldn't shed in front of her mother. Blinking furiously, Zan made excuses and ended the call. What in hell had just happened? It was a lie, she decided. Her mother's idea of an April Fool's joke, though it wasn't April yet. She checked Jerome's social media profile and tried calling him again. She scrolled through her list of contacts looking for his name but couldn't find it. Swearing, she entered his name in the search box and waited for his profile to come up. There he was. She clicked on it and her slow connection flashed an error message. Uttering a few more swear words, Zan refreshed the page and dialed his number on her phone. The phone trilled in her ear as the page loaded. Most of the content wasn't showing because she had to be on his friends list to see it, the page told her. What in hell did that mean? Of course they were friends. They were getting fucking married. Unless he'd broken ties with her so sneakily she hadn't even noticed. Jerome's profile picture popped up on the screen. There, for all the world to see, were Jerome and Kelly, kissing. Hello? Jerome's sleepy voice answered. Zan's blood boiled. You're a fucking wanker. And a pedophile. But mostly a wanker. I hope she kills you in your sleep when she wakes up and realizes what you've done to her, you sick wanker. She hung up. Jerome could go screw himself before she'd ever speak to him again, let alone look at him. To hell with marriage and family and settling down. Where were those contracts? Feverishly, Zan started filling out forms as fast as her fingers would go. Her Australian adventure just got kicked up a notch. She was going to give that resort's celebrity guests such a good time, they'd never want to leave. Just like her. Before she opened the bourbon, Zan had one more call to make. Maya answered on the second ring. Hi, it's Zan Lane. I've read the documents you sent me and I only have one question. There's a clause in the contract that says in the first 6 months, either you or I can terminate my employment with a day's notice for no reason at all. With my work visa, that basically means if you take a dislike to anything I do, I have zero job security and I can be deported on a moment's notice. Can that clause be removed? Is that your only question, Ms. Lane? It sounded like he held his breath. Shouldn't it be? Zan's instincts tingled, but she couldn't think of anything else she wanted to question in the contract. This was a test, surely. Yes. If that clause is gone, and my employment is dependent on my conduct and all the normal employment criteria a permanent employee is entitled to, I'll sign it. Then we have a deal, Ms. Lane? I'll amend the contract and have a fresh copy for you to sign when you arrive at the resort. I'll arrange for you to be flown over on the Friday before you start, so you can spend a weekend here in paradise as a guest before starting your job on the Monday morning. Now shall we discuss your start date? Yes. Zan let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and smiled. Jerome could go to hell for all she cared. She'd earned a stint in paradise and they didn't allow snakes like him through the gate. 13. Only half listening to Norman's gloating tale of how he'd managed to charge some woman twice what the job was worth without her noticing, Phuong reached for the olive oil, but her fingers wrapped around the neck of the peanut oil bottle. Luckily, she realized her mistake, so she quickly corrected it before Norman could see. She emptied the olive oil bottle over the potatoes and shook it to get the last drops out, before adding the pan to the oven. She lowered the empty oil bottle carefully into the recycling bin so the clink didn't interrupt Norman, then jotted cooking oil on the shopping list. Good thing he insisted steak had to be fried in butter or she'd be in trouble. She watched the butter melt and added a fat T-bone to the pan, setting the heat to low so it would cook all the way through like Norman liked it. Or he said he liked it. Yesterday he'd insisted he wanted his steak well done. Who knew what he liked today? A clammy hand crept beneath her skirt and clamped around her bum cheek, squeezing almost to the point of pain. She'd welcome a cuddle from a snake instead of a grope from Norman, and she hated snakes. Damp lips pressed to the back of her neck. Phuong suppressed a shudder as he whispered, "We should have sex to celebrate." No, we damn well shouldn't, Phuong thought, but she resigned herself to it anyway. She reached to turn off the steak, but Norman grabbed her hand. "I'll be hungry after this. Don't keep me waiting for my dinner." Not letting go of her hand, he led her to the bedroom. 10 nauseating minutes later, she dashed back to the kitchen as Norman dealt with the used condom and washed up. Too late. The steak was burned around the edges. Phuong flipped it and reached for a knife to cut away the blackened bits, but Norman had already left the bathroom and he was watching her every move. Sighing, she dropped the knife back in the drawer. Good thing she hadn't cooked any steak for herself, she'd have trouble eating anything tonight. Maybe if she hid the burned bits under a thick layer of gravy, Norman might not notice she'd singed his steak. He wasn't exactly the most observant man. If he had been, he might have noticed her distraction over the last few weeks, as she'd spent all of her waking moments responding to Jason's messages or dreaming about being in bed with him instead of 2-minute Norman. She'd given Jason her email address, so she no longer needed her laptop to talk to him. Now she could access his messages on her phone. And the last one had been his most persuasive yet. He'd asked her to come to him so he could propose to her properly and be her, what had he called it? Knight in shining armor? But only after she kissed him, turning him from a frog into a prince again. Him and his fairy tales, so far removed from real life it made her existence even more depressing. Whisking gravy mix and hot water in a pan, Phuong carefully added more water from the kettle. If Norman found a single lump, he'd whine about her uselessness for half an hour. Though if he did, he might miss the burned meat, and which was the lesser of two evils? Maybe if she got him a beer, he'd be even less perceptive. Phuong gave Norman a perfunctory smile as she set his plate before him. Overcooked peas and potatoes swam in the swamp of gravy that had oozed off his enormous steak. While he surveyed her handiwork, she dashed to the kitchen for his beer. "Are you trying to poison me?" he grunted. "Where's your dinner?" She'd never thought of that, though she wished she had. Phuong recovered quickly. "I wanted to serve you first." She hoped her battered eyelashes distracted him enough. She dished up a small plate of the potatoes for herself, and poured a thin veneer of gravy over the top. Sitting down across from Norman, she cut a small piece of potato and placed it in her mouth. She chewed with feigned delight and forced herself to swallow the starchy vegetable even as it choked her. Norman seemed satisfied. He tucked into his own dinner, dribbling gravy down his front with careless disregard for the work she'd have getting the stains out of his work shirt or the tablecloth. When he took his first bite of steak, he chewed a couple of times before his eyebrows knitted over his nose. Phuong's heart sank. He spat the mouthful onto the tablecloth, leaving a splatter of gravy and spit that reached her plate. "You're the worst fucking cook in the world, Fiona. How many times do I have to tell you I like my steak medium? This one's fucking burned, look." He pointed at the blackened beef on the table. If he hadn't insisted on fucking while she was supposed to be cooking, and told her that today he wanted it only half-cooked, then maybe she could have met his demands. Nothing she did would ever be good enough. "I'm sorry," she said. What else could she say? She wondered if Jason would make her life a living hell like this. If any other man would. "You should be. I give you a good fucking and you can't even make me dinner. You should go back to Thailand and working as a whore. You're not good for anything else." He gulped down a third of his beer. "I'm not from Thailand and there's nothing good about getting naked with you," she wanted to scream for the millionth time, but she stayed silent. He emptied his beer and slammed the bottle on the table. "What are you good for?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Tell me why I should let you stay and be my wife." She knew what he wanted to hear. He wanted her to repeat the phone sex lines he'd demanded in the endless messages on the website where they'd met. "I'm good in bed. I can go all night any way you want to, but only for you, Norman." He grinned. "Get me another beer." She did. He drank slowly, eyeing her over the lip of the bottle. "Tell me why I should fuck you and not some other Thai whore." Phuong swallowed. Only the thought of not getting her citizenship forced the words out. "I'm better than any whore because I'm all yours. Every inch, every night, all night, and no one else can have me but you. You make me so hot, Norman." "Good girl," he slurred. The second empty beer landed on the table. "Get me another one and I'll give it to you all night, Fiona." He reached into his lap to fondle what Phuong knew was limp and little and lasted less time than any man should. He made her wait until he'd finished 6 beers and all of the supposedly inedible steak, before he beckoned her back to the bedroom. Only thoughts of Jason's sexy body got her through the next 15 minutes, as Norman struggled to get it up and blamed it, as he did everything on her. When he finally withdrew and she thought her ordeal was over for the night, she heard him say, "Now I want a massage, whore, for making me work so hard." "Oh, but we're out of massage oil," she lamented. A stinging slap landed on her thigh. "Then use cooking oil, whore. Give me my fucking money's worth and massage me." Forcing her clenched hands to stay by her sides, Phuong left the bed and headed to the kitchen. She grabbed the only bottle of oil in the cupboard, and returned to Norman. This was the last time she'd ever touch him, she swore. When he started snoring, she'd pack her things and leave him forever. Slowly, she upended the oil bottle over his back and started to rub it into his skin. 14. The world seemed so alien below, all red rocks and grey-green scrub that clung to the rocks as desperately as she'd clutched the idea of her future with Jerome. But just like the storms that wreaked havoc up here, Cyclone Kelly had put paid to that dream and she could have the bastard. Ha! Her own bastard baby and his wanker of a father. Poor girl. She was too young to know what she was getting into, but she had to know she was stealing another woman's boyfriend. How many times had Kelly asked to see Zahn's engagement ring so she could ooh and ah over it? Zahn rubbed her finger, which still felt bare after she'd torn off the ring and sold it at the pawnbroker. She gave the money to the women's shelter in town, knowing they needed the money more than she did. The coordinator had invited her in for tea as a token of thanks for her gift, and Zahn had been too polite to refuse. For 15 minutes, she'd sat at the long dining table, reminiscent of school dining halls back in the UK, drinking her scalding tea, until footsteps behind her told her she wasn't alone. When she turned, she met the eyes of a woman who looked as lost as Zahn felt. They'd stared at each other for what felt like forever, recognizing the inner void that they both shared and yet didn't share. It was a lonely, echoing emptiness inside the impenetrable shell Zahn had to maintain to make sure no one saw her loss. She'd loved and then had her heart ripped out and fed to a crocodile. Yet somehow she kept on living, shame settling on her like a shroud. Shame that she'd been foolish enough to trust her heart to a man who only wanted to use it for bait to catch something as heartless as him. Zahn hadn't stayed long after that. She wasn't as finished as these women seemed to feel. She had a new job and all her life ahead of her. Without that bastard Jerome to limit her, who knew how high she could fly? And in a helicopter, no less. Yet now she was up here, she felt so small and insignificant. This huge country with its rugged, unconquered landscape was nothing like home. Not even like the relatively civilized Cable Beach near town. The Dampier Peninsula and the Buccaneer Archipelago beyond had only a few scattered structures on them, connected by tiny ribbons of road. "Where's the island?" Zahn asked dully, scanning the drowned hills that formed the Buccaneer Archipelago. "It's coming up on the horizon in a few minutes." Your first time out there? Sho glanced at her and Zahn nodded. Then I'll do a proper flyby to orient you before we land. Most staff take the carrier boat. The only times I've flown staff to and from the island are when there's an emergency. Zahn waited for him to continue, but as the silence stretched between them, she found she needed to break it. And? What sort of emergencies? Sho seemed intent on the horizon. The sort that you hope won't happen again at a resort like Romance Island. They've had far too many of them lately. That's all I can say. Look, this is a high-class resort, the sort that offers a high degree of privacy for its guests. We all keep its secrets or we don't work here anymore. It's that simple. You may find out about past events if your job requires it, but it's very much a need-to-know basis where nobody really needs to know. You'll get used to it. Most of the people who come out here are those with secrets of their own, the staff and the guests. Some are running from something and the rest are hiding something. Which are you? Zahn summoned a wan smile. That's my secret and you don't need to know. Touché. Sho extended his hand to point at a shadow on the horizon. There's the resort. It doesn't look like much now, but wait until you see. The bump on the water resolved into colors, cream green and a milky blue arranged in two lines. No, wait, a V-shape. No, it was. Bloody hell. No wonder it's called Romance Island. That can't be natural. Zahn stared at the heart-shaped island with a lagoon in the middle. Jetties on either side made it look like it had been pierced by a giant Cupid's arrow. Kind of like her heart still felt, but without the love such a missile was supposed to inspire. It mostly is. There are a couple of others the same shape up and down the coast, but this one's the biggest and the lagoon's actually a big rock pool, one of the few places calm enough for coral to grow. It's meant to have some of the best snorkeling and diving this side of Rolly Shoals. Sho peered wistfully at the water as the helicopter moved in a tight turn around the island. Meant to? You mean you haven't been in yourself? Zahn asked. Sho shrugged. The resort's tour guide promised she'd take me, but she left in a bit of a hurry before I could take her up on the offer. I'm a qualified dive master. I could take you, Zahn offered. The helicopter pilot stared at her in what looked like surprise. Really? Well, if you get time, just let me know. I'd appreciate it. For the first time in what felt like days, Zahn laughed. I always make time for diving. When the weather's right and with a dive site on my doorstep, I won't let anything stop me from taking a daily dip. The last time I dived was Ningaloo though, before I came to Broome, so I can't wait to get back into it. Another long look followed before Sho said abruptly, hang on. Coming into land. Welcome to Romance Island Resort. I hope you enjoy your stay. Zahn settled back in her seat, mulling over the mysteries Sho had hinted at. First were the emergencies he wouldn't discuss. What had happened at the resort that had to be kept so quiet? Was it anything to do with her predecessor, who'd left so suddenly? And what was with the strange looks? Did Sho know something about the island that she didn't? Then there was Maya's easy acceptance of her contract variation. That didn't sit right. She'd never had a job in Australia where they hadn't told her that the probation period was a standard condition they couldn't change, but then she'd never been on this new visa, either. If she didn't know better, she'd swear there was something suspicious about this whole resort, but no one else in Broome had a bad word to say about the place. Unless you counted the cost of staying there, of course. Everyone wanted to visit, and they bemoaned the fact that they couldn't afford it. Well, for now, it was her home, and Zahn was determined to unravel the mystery behind this place. She slid out of the helicopter and breathed deeply. Salt, heat and humidity, with the sibilance of waves breaking endlessly on a beach somewhere through the palm trees and pandanus. If she closed her eyes, she could be standing on Cable Beach. Except there weren't any vehicles on the island. This place was an eco-resort, one that claimed to be so environmentally friendly even the wildlife welcomed guests to the island. Maybe the island's secrets involved the wildlife. Zahn scanned the jungle, lingering on the glimpse of aquamarine that marked the lagoon. A resident sea monster, she guessed, before she burst out laughing. What's funny? Sho asked. Zan fought to regain her composure, waving her hands around. Just wondering if there's a sea monster living in the lagoon. Sho shrugged. When you've had a chance to go diving in there, Ms. Lane, you tell me. The clouds overhead chose that moment to dump a downpour on her head, so Zan sprinted for the shelter of a nearby building, leaving Sho on the landing pad. Mysteries, a meeting with Maya, and maybe even a sea monster. At least today would be different. Zan needed a distraction from the despair threatening to overwhelm her. Romance Island Resort promised to deliver that and more. 15. Phuong breathed a sigh of relief as her car started. Norman had kept her locked in the house for so long, she was scared the battery might have been flat. As it was, she intended to drive as far and as fast as she could away from Norman. She'd been stupid to waste so much time on a man who only saw her as his slave, someone he kept captive in his house for sex and menial work. She'd have been better off turning to prostitution like Lynn had. Norman was right about one thing: all her efforts with him had been useless. She'd been useless. She had 2/3 of a business degree, and she hadn't seen a losing deal even when she was in it. Perhaps her brother was right, and educating her was a waste of money. How could she possibly save her father's company if she couldn't even negotiate a deal that resulted in her completing her degree? 2 months with Norman that she had nothing to show for, except some additional cooking skills and the ability to feign interest in sex, when she hated the man lying on top of her. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd wanted to vomit in his face, instead of submitting to his disgusting rutting. It would be a long time before she wanted to share a bed with any man again. Well, unless he had the body of a Greek god like Jason did. She'd make an exception for him. A mad plan formed in her mind. She'd go find Jason. Drive up to Broome and the resort where he worked and see if he truly was the man he said he was. After talking to him online for so long, she felt like she knew him as no one else did, and she couldn't deny she'd been fantasizing about him since he'd first made contact with her. She'd made a mistake with Norman, but now she had a chance to start anew with Jason. University enrollment and the fee payment deadline were only weeks away. All that time she'd wasted with Norman had denied her this semester of study, but if things worked out with Jason, maybe she could enroll next semester. Yes. That's what she'd do. So she drove and drove and drove some more until dawn blazed on her right, half blinding her. Where was she? She'd been driving between creamy sand dunes for a while now, and a sign pointing to a backpacker's place guided her to a decision. That's where she'd sleep, and when she woke, she could buy a map and keep driving to Broome. It couldn't be that far surely, she thought as she collapsed on her dormitory bunk. Oblivion retreated when she heard voices murmuring in a language she didn't know. Her eyes snapped open and she leaped up, bashing her head on the underside of the bed above her. Bunk beds? She'd never shared a room before Norman. What she'd have given to be separated from him in bunk beds instead of forced to share his double bed. No more though. She was free. The foreign couple stared at her, so she forced a smile and told them she was okay. She shouldered her bag and stumbled out of the room in search of a bathroom. Sometime later, feeling freshened up but starving, she followed her nose to the kitchen. The smell of toast and bacon told her that she'd slept right through the rest of the day and into the next. In the huge communal kitchen, she found the couple who'd woken her. "Good morning," the girl greeted her with a strong German accent. "I'm Ria and this is Hans." She pointed at the man, who was now sniffing delicately at a sachet of Vegemite, the salty Australian spread that Phuong knew was the best hangover cure known to man if you could keep it down. "We're from Germany and we're traveling around Australia. How about you? Where are you from?" Phuong licked her lips. Should she say she was Aussie or Singaporean? Which would confuse anyone more if they were following her. Did it matter? "I'm driving up to Broome," she said. "Would you like company?" Ria offered. "We wanted to visit Broome, but it's so far to drive and the flights are very expensive. We can give you money toward fuel and help you drive if you like." She added something in German to Hans, who stared at Phuong with interest. Phuong lowered her eyes under their scrutiny. "That would be nice. I've never been to Broome before. If you have a map and know the way, we could share costs." She didn't have any money, she'd paid for her accommodation with a credit card too. So stupid. If anyone was following her, all they'd need to do was track transactions. She needed to visit a bank and fill the car with fuel before she left town and disappeared properly. "I'll leave in an hour, meet you here?" "Sure," Ria said, her friendly smile reassuring Phuong just the tiniest bit. No one would smile that happily if they knew they were driving with a fugitive. Her secret would be safe for a little longer. 16. "Ooh, you must be Ms. Lane." Pale blonde hair framing a pixie-like face, complete with a picture-perfect pink frangipani tucked behind one ear, captured Zahn's attention before she dropped her gaze to the receptionist's name tag. "Call me Zahn, please, Heloise," she replied with a tight smile. Heloise flashed a set of impossibly white teeth before smothering her giggle. "If you say so, Ms. Lane, Zahn. None of us were sure how to pronounce your name. Is it short for Alexandra?" "No." Zahn moistened her lips, suddenly wishing she'd had time to tidy herself up, and the drenching downpour hadn't helped matters. She was painfully aware of the difference between backpackers and this resort's elite clientele, and this vision of perfection whose only job was greeting guests brought it firmly into focus. Did all the staff look like they'd stepped out of the pages of a magazine? Would she be expected to do the same? If the resort had a day spa, she needed to book in for everything immediately. "Ms. Lane?" Zahn turned and found herself face to face with Max Meyer, to her relief. He didn't look half as polished as Heloise. She hitched her smile back up. "As promised. Thanks for sending a helicopter." Meyer nodded curtly. "With a storm forecast for the weekend, I wasn't taking any chances that the road would be closed. When that happens, flying's the only way in or out of here." Talk about remote. Zahn found herself nodding. She'd heard horror stories about the Cape Levesque Road. Her watching the rusty ribbon twist through scrubland as they flew up the peninsula this morning was the closest she'd ever come to traveling along it. "Good to know." He coughed. "Shall we go to my office?" When Zahn nodded again, he led the way and gestured for her to take a seat before he closed the door. His steps were heavy as he crossed the room, his shoulders slumped as if he carried the weight of the world. When he sank into his seat, his knuckles whitened in a death grip on the chair arms. He couldn't have had a worse week than hers, Zahn mused. She'd never drunk so much bourbon in such a short time. She glanced around at the prints on his walls. There was a photo of him holding a giant fish, but none of anyone else. Maybe Meyer didn't have a wife and kids. Meyer pushed a stapled pile of papers across the desk. "Your amended contract." He clicked a pen several times, so it sounded more like a nervous tick than a firm cocking of a favorite weapon, and handed it to Zahn. She set the pen down and perused the pages. At first glance, it looked identical. "Is this the same as the first one you sent?" "No." Meyer leaned across the desk and flipped to the page about her probation period. "There. No probation. You start work on Monday as a permanent employee, once we've both signed the contract." He didn't meet her eyes. Zahn stared at the space no longer occupied by the offending paragraph. A permanent job in paradise. Why did it seem too good to be true? "What's wrong? Now you've seen the place, you don't want to work here? Is that it?" Meyer's eyes held a challenge. "I hope you haven't been wasting my time, Ms. Lane." "No. I've signed all the rest of the paperwork and accepted the position. It's just a feeling. Isn't there always a snake in paradise?" Zahn attempted to smile but worried that she'd produced a sick grimace instead. Meyer started, then recovered so quickly Zahn wondered if she'd imagined it. "We do get some gorgeous sea snakes in the lagoon. Part of living in a tropical paradise." He nodded at the contract. "Aside from the deleted clause, I assure you it's identical to the one I emailed you originally. Are you going to sign it, or shall I call the pilot to take you back to the mainland?" Give up now? Had Meyer found someone else he preferred to give the job to, after all the paperwork she'd filled out? No way in hell was she going home now. There was nothing left for her in the UK. Zan scrawled her signature on the contract, not caring if it was legible or not. Of course not. I'll see out my contract, and when the first year's up, perhaps even extend it. Sea snakes don't scare me, Max. I've swum with sharks and I'll do it again. She pushed the papers back to him. His breath hissed out and he deflated. She expected him to look defeated, but Maya seemed relieved. Maybe he hadn't wanted someone else in the job after all, but was being pushed by the owners to take on a different applicant. Too late now, the contract was signed. The position was hers and no one else's. So what now? Zan prompted. You'll start work on Monday morning, as we discussed. Your office and accommodation will be ready for you then too. In the meantime, I'll get Heloise to arrange a guest room for you in the hotel. You can spend the weekend exploring the island, seeing what we offer our guests, before working on how you can improve on the experience Monday morning. Maya tapped on his computer keyboard. Meals and everything are included, of course. We have award-winning chefs in our restaurant, as it's what our high-profile clients expect. He rose and offered his hand. Welcome aboard, Ms. Lane. She shook his clammy hand, then tried to surreptitiously wipe hers on her shorts. Whatever secrets this place held, it had to be better than arguing over $10 forks. As for the frog freakouts, well, she wouldn't miss the screaming. 17. Phuong wanted to scream until she ran out of breath. We should have stopped at that roadhouse, Hans lamented for what Phuong thought was the third time. She hunched over the steering wheel and kept driving, wishing he'd shut up, but he didn't. I saw clouds over there and it looked like rain. If we camp, we'll get rained on when that storm comes in. We should go back to the roadhouse. The mini one? They only had motel rooms and they were full. Besides, that was over 100 kilometers back. Those clouds were in the east. Everyone knows the weather comes in from the west here. We're better off camping, Hans. Where's your sense of adventure? Ria's enthusiasm was almost as grating, Phuong decided. We should stop soon. There's a bridge ahead. That means a river. That would be a good place to camp. Phuong rubbed her eyes and managed to discern the bridge in the distance. She couldn't see much in the way of water beneath it, but she did need rest. Not to mention Hans and Ria would hopefully be silent while they slept. Sleepily, she followed Ria's directions as the girl pointed to a track that led from the road down to the dry riverbed. She didn't follow the track though. Her little hatchback wasn't a four-wheel drive and the steep incline didn't look like something her car could handle. She mumbled something to that effect and Ria nodded cheerfully, as they ground to a halt in the gravel beside the road. Not for the first time, Phuong wondered if the girl was on some kind of drugs. No one could possibly be that happy all the time. Hans continued moaning about camping in the rain, until Ria agreed to set up camp under the bridge, in the dry riverbed. Well, almost dry. Hans had sounded almost venomous when he shouted back that there was water in the river. A trickle, but it was still water. Phuong leaned against her car until Ria shouldered her last bag and headed down the incline with it. With no camping gear to speak of and only a small bag of clothes to her name, Phuong intended to sleep in the car, where snakes and all manner of creepy crawlies couldn't get to her. Camping was for crazy backpackers. Sighing, she pushed the driver's seat as far back as it would go and pulled out her phone. She hadn't checked her email since she'd left Norman's flat, even though she'd heard the trill of incoming messages in Geraldton. The first one she clicked on was from Jason. He'd taken a picture of himself in some kid's inflatable boat, so small his legs stuck over the side, centimeters above clear water that was teeming with what looked like baby sharks. Whatever they weren't much bigger than his feet. Beneath the picture, he'd written, "Maybe you're a little mermaid and that's why you haven't given me your answer? Pick up your shell phone, sexy siren. Save me from this shark-infested shipwreck, so we can live happily ever after." For the first time in days she smiled. If her phone had had a signal, she'd have replied on the spot with a resounding yes. She wanted to shout it so loud that her voice rolled across the scrubby desert vegetation, all the way across the sea to his lonely island, where she'd join him soon. Cuddling her phone to her chest, Phuong sank into sleep. Everything would be better in the morning. 18. For a long time, Zan stared at the tiny bottle of bourbon from the hotel's minibar. It wasn't big enough to deaden the pain tonight. She'd have to go to the bar if that's what she wanted. Hauling herself to her feet, Zan peered at her reflection. Bloodshot eyes and a red nose from crying too much. Jerome didn't deserve a single tear from her, but she'd shed thousands in the nights since she'd learned of his betrayal. The cowardly bastard hadn't even tried to apologize, he hadn't called or emailed or even sent her a damn text message. Did he know how many hot men she'd turned down during her trip? A veritable army of flying frogmen. Being faithful to that faithless toad. She could have had hot sex every night of the week instead of just imagining it. Zan burst out laughing. As if she'd ever done that. When she'd slept with Jerome, it had been short and sweet, that's all. Hot sex was the stuff of the battered books left behind at the backpackers. One-night stands weren't something she'd ever done. Why start now? Because the biggest bastard in Britain had broken her heart, and for this weekend, she was just another anonymous guest in paradise. For a moment, she considered it. Going to a pub to shag a sexy stranger? Why the hell not? She washed her face in the basin, scrubbing at her skin until all traces of tears were washed away. No amount of concealer could hide the dark circles under her eyes, but bars didn't have the brightest lighting anyway. A bit of bright lipstick and swapping her shirt and shorts for her little black dress would do, surely. Her heels ticked on the tiled floor as she made her way down the corridor, past reception and into the bar. The jungle, it was called, and the potted palms scattered around made it look like the vegetation outside. Weaving her way through tables and trees, Zan found the place surprisingly empty for a Friday night. Not like the Roebuck Hotel or Diver's Tavern back in Broome, the bar at either of those would be crowded 3 or 4 deep by now, yet she stood alone at this one, with the bartender's full attention. "What can I get you?" he asked easily. A whole bottle of bourbon, she thought, but didn't say. Drinking herself under the table wasn't the best way to seduce a man, or not the sort she wanted anyway. Zan raised her eyes to the menu on the wall. "You know your first drink's free, don't you? Your warm welcome to the resort?" Zan didn't, but she wasn't sure that applied to her anyway. "I'll have a beer." "What do you have?" The barman grinned. "The best beer we have here is local. Once you've tasted it, you won't want anything else. I'll start you off with a mango." "No," Zan interrupted. "If you have matzos, I'll take the ginger. With plenty of ice." The barman raised an eyebrow. "Not your first time here then?" He jerked his chin. "ID." Zan almost laughed. Did he think she was under 18? He wasn't laughing though, so she fumbled for her wallet. "Not that kind." He tapped his wrist, or more accurately the oversized digital watch he wore. "Your resort ID." "Oh." Zan unclipped her matching wristband and held it out. "Sorry." The barman hesitated before he finally took it. The scanner pad beeped and he handed the watch back, his eyes on the screen. You're Miss Lane?" "Yes." He straightened and held out his hand. "I'm sorry, I thought you'd be older. I'm Marcel. Mostly I work the bar, but my speciality is hen's parties." He winked. "I'm a very skilled dancer. Those nights I'm Magic Marcel." Zan blinked. Blushed. Blinked again. She'd never met a man so proud to admit he was a stripper. Then again, she'd seen the queue that night the Sun Cinemas had screened the latest Magic Mike movie. "Call me Zan," she replied, shaking his hand. "Is it normally this quiet?" She waved her free hand at the empty bar. He shrugged. "It's dinner time in the wet season. Most guests are still in the restaurant. When they close, everyone moves here, but with the races on, most people are in town for the weekend." The races? How could she have forgotten? If she'd still been working at the Backpackers, she'd have been trackside with most of the guests. Most of town too, admittedly. She'd never been a big fan of horse racing back in the UK, but here in Broome, with the red dirt track, it was a far cry from the turf at home. Marcel set her drink on a tray. You're welcome to sit at the bar, but the best spot tonight is out on the veranda overlooking the ocean." He grabbed the tray and walked away. Zaan slid off her bar stool and followed him. He placed her drink on a dimly lit table by the veranda railing. "If there's a storm you'll see lightning and waves, but if the clouds clear up you get a sky full of stars." Marcel leaned out over the railing and pointed. "The rain stopped and the moon's rising over there in a few hours, so I think you're in for the Milky Way tonight." He glanced back. "Enjoy it?" He returned to the bar, where a well-dressed couple waited to be served. Zaan sat back, sipping her drink as she watched the bar patrons instead of the sky. They entered in pairs, dressed for a fancy dinner and not a night at the pub, and the only single men were her father's age or older. Business executives or whatever they weren't her type. No, if Zaan intended to throw away her principles for a night, it would be with some hot young stud, not a silver fox who'd expect her to fulfill his fantasies. Oh no, she'd looked too long. A man who looked 50 if he was a day, flashed her welcoming smile and gestured toward the empty seat across from him. Zaan blushed and shook her head. He raised his whiskey glass in a toast to her before his eyes darted elsewhere. Allowing herself to breathe again, Zaan kept her eyes on the darkness outside, where the stars had started to appear. Well, mostly planets at first, she figured, wishing she knew more about Southern Hemisphere constellations. Hey, that was something she could put on her list of activities for the hotel, stargazing. "You can't see a fucking thing from there," drawled a voice in the darkness. Zaan peered out to find the source of the voice, but he was right about one thing: she couldn't see him. She could hear the approaching footsteps though, as the voice's owner ascended the veranda steps and strode across the deck. Now she could see everything not covered by his board shorts, which was the only clothing the man wore. Not that he needed to cover up a body that rivaled that of the Flying Frog Man. What she could see of it, anyway. He swigged from a half-full bottle of bourbon, slammed it down on her table, and wiped his mouth on his forearm. Judging by his unsteady gait, the rest of the bourbon was already sloshing through his bloodstream. He flashed a grin. "You're new and you're hot too." Hands down, Bourbon Boy was the youngest bloke present. Definitely the only one under 30, except maybe the barman. But Zaan had no intention of settling for less than stellar if it came to sex. Who isn't? The wet season in Broom's humid and hot as hell. Hence why I'm drinking. She lifted her glass to her lips and sipped the liquid that remained. Mostly melted ice, but that didn't matter. "You're out." Bourbon Boy snapped his fingers. "Oi, Marcel. Lady here needs another." Zaan turned in time to see the irritation on Marcel's face before he nodded and ducked beneath the counter. In no time at all, the smiling barman brought her a second drink. "Here you are, Ms. Zaan. I'll put in the drinks order on Monday morning, so let me know if you'd like the distributor to put another case on the truck for you. We only get a delivery once a fortnight in wet season, you see, so if we run out, it could be another 3 weeks before we get any more." 3 weeks for more beer? They really were in the middle of nowhere out here. She thanked Marcel, who frowned at Bourbon Boy before returning to the bar. The bottle of bourbon upended, glugging down the man's throat. An amber stream trickled from the side of his mouth down the ridges of his sculpted chest and abs. He caught her staring and grinned. "Well, Zaan. I'm Jay. Come with me. I'll get you closer to the stars than you ever thought possible." He grabbed her hand in his free one and tugged. "My drink?" "Bring it." She barely had time to seize the ginger beer bottle before Jay yanked her out of her seat. With his fierce grip on her hand, she had no choice but to follow him down the stairs and into the dark. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, trying valiantly to free herself. "Relax, Zaan. We're not leaving the island. I'm taking you to the private Penguin jetty." He bumped the bourbon bottle against his wristband. "Your tracker will keep you safe. Hotel security are watching your every move. Plus a panic button if you need help. Just tap it and security will come rescue you." "What?" Zaan glanced at her wristband, but it was too dark to see much of it. It was her ID and room key she knew, but a tracking device? It was as big as those deluxe diving watches in the dive shop in town, so the wristband could hold a GPS, but the expense of handing them out to every guest. Wouldn't do to lose a VIP, sweetheart. Want me to show you the stars like you've never seen them before? Bourbon Boy Jay took another unsteady step on the path. How much trouble could she get into anyway? This was paradise and her new home. Sure. 19. Phuong woke up with cold feet. Not just cold either, soaking wet. That couldn't be right. She jumped up and bumped her head on the ceiling, a painful reminder that she was in her car, where there shouldn't be any water. Peering down, she saw dark water swirling in the footwell. How on earth? She glanced out the window, scanning the scene that seemed even more unbelievable in the pre-dawn light. Her car sat in a shallow stream so wide that she couldn't see the other side, or the bridge she'd crossed last night. As the light brightened, she realized what she was seeing wasn't a stream at all, but the return of the river that hadn't been home last night. Somehow, water upstream had come flooding down here, and it was already over the wheels of her car. If she didn't get out of there quickly, she'd be swept away, car and all. Phuong wrenched her key in the ignition, praying to anyone who'd listen that her engine would work. By some miracle, it coughed into life. She shoved the car into gear, slamming her foot into the puddle to floor the accelerator. When she reached dry road, she slowed the car to a stop and burst into tears. She'd come so close to dying in that flood. Good thing she hadn't slept under the bridge with those two backpackers, who... Her heart plummeted. Hans and Ria. She twisted around in her seat, peering back at the way she'd come, but there was no sign of them. Their campsite had been obliterated by the raging river while she slept. There was nothing she could do. She didn't have a car that could go off-road, and she didn't have any rope to pull them to safety, even if she found them. Her best bet was to drive to the next roadhouse and ask for help there. Grimly, she ground her car into gear and sped away from the torrent that had taken her traveling companions. What else could go wrong? 20. After a moment, Zan forced Jay to stop so she could slip off her heels. Clutching her shoes and her drink to her chest with her free arm, Zan trotted beside him, their bare feet slapping on the faintly lit path through the jungle. Waves crashed, leaves rustled, and something swooped between the trees overhead, but Zan couldn't see any of it clearly. Even the stars above only appeared between the gaps of the palm tree canopy, turning the path into a tunnel of sorts. But a tunnel to where? Where are we going? Zan demanded. I told you. The private penguin jetty. What the hell does that mean? It's a jetty and it's private and it has no lights, so it's the best place to look at the stars. Jay pointed into the darkness ahead, where the lights ended. There. What about the private penguins? None of this made sense. There aren't any. It's the wet season and we're the only ones here. Not that anyone ever comes here. Guests don't stay in Villa Penguin. You can come here whenever you want. Jay dragged her further into the dark. This was stupid. Zan fished out her phone and held it up so she could see where she was going. To her surprise, he was right. Before them was a wooden jetty extending out over midnight-colored waves, though it wasn't even 9 o'clock yet according to her phone. Too early to be doing crazy stuff. Her feet didn't agree with her though. They kept walking, even when the paved path ended in damp wooden boards. She should turn around and go to bed, alone. Now lie down, Jay ordered. Zan burst out laughing. As if. First the arrogant prick had dragged her all the way out here without explaining why or where, and now he thought he could demand sex? Screw you. Maybe later, babe, but I'm gonna do the stars first. First clear night in ages. He threw his empty bourbon bottle over the waves and stretched out at the end of the jetty, folding his hands behind his head. And turn that fucking phone off. Can't see as much when there's lights on. She stared at him. He really wanted to stare at the stars? And here she'd thought it was a euphemism for something. She tucked her phone away. Sighing, she settled on the jetty, sipped her drink, and lifted her eyes. Wow, the weirdo was right. With the lights off and her vision adjusting to the darkness, she could see millions of stars, like a spray of glitter across the whole damn sky. Sitting cross-legged and twisting her neck around to look straight up wasn't the most comfortable way to do this, though. Zaan glanced at Jay, who was too intent on the sky to notice her anymore. So much for seduction or a one-night stand. Stars it would be. Safer too. She set her empty bottle down. Scooting her bum along the jetty to put more distance between Jay's body and hers, Zaan lay back and looked up. What she'd thought was a cloud at first resolved into 1,000 tiny pinpricks, each a sun so far away she'd never seen it before. Light flared on the edge of her vision. She turned her head just in time to see something streak across the sky before it vanished. "Did you see that?" she and Jay said at the same time. "You have to make a wish for shooting stars," Zaan added, fervently wishing to succeed in her role at the resort. "That's bullshit," Jay grunted. "Wishes don't come true, and all the fairy tales your parents told you as a kid are the biggest lie of all." Zaan wasn't sure what to respond with. What could you say? You make plans but they all go to shit. I loved her for years. Since primary school. Knew we'd be together one day. I just had to be patient and wait, so we'd have our happy ending. Jay laughed harshly. But she had other ideas for Prince Charming. Rapist bastard. What? Zaan sat up. Who? Prince Charming, of course. The fucker had his way with Sleeping Beauty. That's what woke her up. She should have threatened him with a knife. Zaan said lightly, "That's not the Disney story I remember. Cartoons for kids. Nothing like real life. She picked the one who hurt her and threatened me. I'd never hurt her. Never. But she's marrying the violent bastard. I tried to protect her from him. I did. No thank you though. No, she's going to marry him and I have to leave the fucking country." Jay's voice dropped too low for her to understand, though Zaan hadn't understood much of his rambling. Zaan ignored him and watched for more shooting stars. She could do with another wish or two. Or a flurry of lights flared and vanished like a cloud of sparks in the sky. Enough for more wishes than she could think of. She wished her parents would stay safe and healthy while she was here. That she'd solve the resort's mysteries. That Jerome's dick would fall off. That she'd get her own happy ending one day and it would be nothing like Jay's bitter ramblings. Nothing like Jay at all. Zaan glanced at Jay, who'd fallen silent. "Jay?" He let out a loud snore. Oh, how charming. No wonder his princess had chosen Prince Charming over him. Zaan rose and made her way back to the lit path. Better to go to bed alone than to make a mistake with a man she barely knew. "Maybe not, baby," she whispered. Jay snored on, oblivious, while she headed back to her hotel room. 21. Phuong crept across the third flooded section of road, hoping that the water wasn't too deep to cross. Warning signs on both sides of the road told of the dangers of being swept away, as if she needed the reminder. Hans and Ria might be dead now and she'd nearly joined them. Her tires made a crunching sound instead of the swish of traveling through the creek, and Phuong let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She couldn't stop though. She had to continue to the next roadhouse to tell them what had happened so they'd send help. She just had to keep going. Over a bridge that rose out of yet another brown torrent, but this river hadn't reached the top of the bridge yet. She sped across the bridge and almost cried when the roadhouse came into view as she rounded the bend. For a place in the middle of nowhere, it sure was a popular spot. Cars, trucks and caravans were parked everywhere except at the petrol pumps. People filled the shop, spilling out onto the veranda and even queuing on the paving outside. While she waited for the crowd to disperse, Phuong filled her car with fuel, figuring that she'd need it for the long round trip to the river and back. The throng didn't thin, so she joined the end of the line and settled in for a long wait. After what felt like forever, she finally made it inside the shop, where the privileged few had access to air conditioning and a TV tuned to the morning news. The news anchor frowned as she described flooding and road closures throughout the Gascogne. The pictures on TV cut to yellow barriers on what looked like the road outside. Yes, they were outside, she realized, peering through the dusty glass. She wouldn't be able to return for Hans and Ria until the road reopened. Phuong turned back to the news report, hoping to hear when that might be, but the program had already moved to another news story, a missing persons report. Phuong gasped as her own face occupied the screen. "If you see Fiona, please contact police or encourage her to make herself known." She had to get out of there before anyone recognized her, but her legs had turned to jelly. She couldn't go back to Norman. Wouldn't go back to the life of a slave. Slowly, Phuong forced her feet to take one step, then another, slipping between the queuing customers to the warm, dusty air outside. Her hands shook as she unlocked her car and slid the keys into the ignition, but she had to go. Shoving the car into gear, Phuong headed for the highway, hoping no one had seen her, or if they had, that they hadn't recognized her. She had to get to Jason and his island paradise. For all Jason's jokes, she'd need a knight in shining armor to save her from Norman. 22. This was paradise. No question about it. 2 days spent drinking in the bar, lazing on the beach in between downpours, snorkeling in the lagoon, getting thoroughly thrashed at beach volleyball by a woman twice her age, moaning in delight at the restaurant chef's magical creations at mealtimes. By Monday morning, Zan didn't want to leave Romance Island Resort. She was thoroughly in love with the place. She hadn't seen Jay since Friday night, but that was fine by her. She didn't want to build a reputation for sleeping with guests, however well built they might be. Some of those older guys might get ideas. Zan laughed into the shower spray. For the first time since Jerome's betrayal, she felt hope for the future. Oh sure, she still wanted to rip his balls off and watch him choke on them while he bled to death, but she'd managed to hold 2 hours without fantasizing about it. That was progress right there. Admittedly, she had been snorkeling through the shark nursery at the time, and the thought of 1,000 hungry baby sharks shredding the flesh from his bones while he screamed had provided quite a distraction, but she had to hurry or she'd be late for work. She'd spent too long stressing over what to wear on her first day. Casual or formal business attire? After all, a tour guide could be doing anything from diving through to meeting and greeting VIPs. In the end, the humidity had won. She'd chosen a business skirt but paired it with a sleeveless top. Zan packed her belongings back into her suitcase, in anticipation of moving to her official accommodation during the morning. She hesitated when she reached her suit jacket, the one that matched her skirt. It was too hot to wear, but if circumstances required it, Zan threw the jacket over her arm and wheeled her suitcase out behind her, hoping she looked as put together as possible. "Checking out?" The man at reception greeted her. "Sort of," Zan replied. "I've been staying in the hotel, but I start work this morning, so it looks like the luxury part of my stay is over and it's time to shift to the staff accommodation. I'm Zan Lane." He shook her hand. "Toby? Usually I split the night porter shifts with Dan here, but I sort of got conscripted into doing day shift today. What with," he coughed, "everything and all." He stared at the computer for a moment before he added, "Hey Dan, can you take her to her new place?" Dan, who'd just reached the outside door, turned and nodded. "Sure, if housekeeping had done cleaning. Pamela said she was doing it first thing this morning." Before Dan was done speaking, Toby had the phone to his ear, nodding as he spoke to someone called Annette. After less than a minute, he hung up again. "Yeah, Pamela's done. Should be safe to go through." Dan held the door and Zan hurried to follow him, dragging her luggage. "Let me get that," he said after a moment, relieving her of the bag. "We lost a bit of the decking in the last cyclone, so it'll be a rough ride for the wheels until we get it fixed. Maintenance are on it though. Just waiting for the supply truck to get through the road closures." Zan found herself nodding as Dan pointed out the staff dining room, communal bathroom facilities and individual staff bedrooms in what looked more like mining accommodation dongas than buildings at a prestigious hotel. They made the rooms at Broom Backpackers look palatial by comparison. She hadn't considered she might be worse off than she'd been in the house she'd shared in town with a couple of tour guides. Single beds and cramped quarters. Mentally, she shook herself. She'd stayed in worse. Her flat back home for a start. All she had to do in her room was sleep here. When she wasn't working, she could spend every spare minute making the most of living in paradise. Dan bumped her suitcase up some steps to a veranda where the doors were more widely spaced. He stopped at the one on the end. "You'll need your ID." Hesitantly, Zaan lifted her wristband to the scanner, which beeped before the door clicked. Dan twisted the handle and opened the door for her, waiting for Zaan to precede him before he brought her bag in. "I'm buggered, so I'm going to bed, unless you need anything else?" When Zaan shook her head, he gave her a tired nod and ambled away. Zaan let her breath out in a relieved hiss. Instead of a box she could barely move in, she stood in the living area of a flat bigger than the one she'd had at home. Kitchen, couch, TV, and even a dining table fitted comfortably in it. She peered through a doorway and found a bedroom with an ensuite bathroom visible through another open door. For a one-bedroom flat, it dwarfed the bedsit she'd had back home. But she had work to do, so after dragging her bag to the bedroom, Zaan returned to reception. She caught Toby's eye. Max mentioned I had an office?" "Max? Oh, Mr. Meyer. Right. He said we had to call him that in front of guests, because he was the manager and all. Yeah, your office is through here. Heloise said the paperwork and your temporary passwords would be on the desk, waiting for you." He led the way down the corridor to an office Zaan could have sworn was the one Meyer had taken her to on Friday, but both he and his photographed fish were gone. The place looked sterile. "So is it Heloise's day off? What do you do here on your days off? Is there a fly-in fly-out arrangement with shifts like the mine sites?" Toby coughed. "Not really. We usually catch the carrier boat to the Pearl Farm and drive to town from there. The resort keeps a couple of four-wheel drives on the mainland, but most of the staff park our cars at the farm too. Heloise, she doesn't work here anymore." Zaan stopped. Heloise hadn't acted like a disgruntled employee when Zaan saw her at reception over the weekend. Even yesterday afternoon, she'd seen the girl chatting at length with one of the guests. Why not? What happened? Yesterday she was out of uniform on reception. Toby licked his lips, his eyes darting around to look at anything but Zaan. "And it's instant dismissal for anyone not seen in public areas in full uniform? Sounds a bit draconian if you ask me." Zaan waited until Toby met her eyes. "If this is some sort of prank you play on new staff, don't bother. Oh, and I know all about the local drop bears too. I used to run the backpackers in town. What happened with Heloise?" Toby crept to the corridor, peered around, then quietly closed the door. His dropped to a whisper, "It's not a joke. She was out of uniform on reception. Wearing nothing but that pink flower, twined around some naked guest on the desk. Some guests walked in on them and, well, they asked to see the manager. Mr. Meyer didn't really have much choice. They left in the same helicopter yesterday." "Right. No having sex in the hotel foyer in front of the guests." Zaan could see how that could be a fireable offense. Not that she ever intended to. The rest of Toby's words sank in. "So Meyer's not here?" "Oh no," Toby replied slowly, as if that was obvious. He waved at the stack of papers on the desk. "But he left all that for you. You should be good," he said. Zaan smiled broadly. Yes. Yes, she would. We'll see, I guess. With no boss to report to, this was going to be an interesting day. What if she had questions? "Do you know when he'll be back?" Toby laughed. "Well, never. At least, that's what he said. That's why you're here. The new hotel manager." "Wait, I'm what, sorry?" Zaan reached for the stack of papers and found her signed contract. She leafed feverishly through the pages until she found the bit about her job title and duties. It was right there in black and white, hotel manager, not tours and activities manager, like she'd applied for. And she'd signed the damn thing without a protest. 23. Incessant banging startled Phuong from a sound sleep and made her peer through her dust-caked windows in panic. A demon in a small boy's body grinned at her, drummed on her car one more time and skipped off happily at having raised hell. No one else was in sight, though the road trains she'd parked between had since left, and the sun was high in the sky. The roadhouse was open now, which meant she could get more fuel and be on her way. Driving this far made her car slurp fuel like fish drank water. Hundreds of kilometers every day until she reached her final destination. How much longer to go? Which roadhouse was this? Phuong craned her neck to read the sign. Sandfire. If she'd read the map right, this was the last roadhouse before the turn-off to Broome. Sometime this afternoon, she'd be able to stop running. And maybe, just maybe, she'd be safe. But she had to get there first. She started her car and trundled to the fuel pumps, then stiffly got out. Tonight she'd sleep in a bed and not her car, she swore. Flexing her fingers, she tried to work out the cramps from her death grip on the steering wheel, but still her hands ached. Even holding the pump handle hurt. Finally, the fuel tank was full. Phuong shook the pump to extract the last few drops before sealing the tank that was her ticket to Broome. She staggered into the shop, counting out cash to cover her fuel. A display of discount chocolate bars caught her eye. When had she last eaten or drunk anything? She dumped a handful of random snacks on the counter, as her stomach rumbled its approval. It wasn't enough though, her dry mouth tasted like a rat had nested in it. She grabbed a bottle of water and added it to the pile. The shop assistant barely glanced at her. She told Phuong the total, checked the cash and deposited it in the till with a disinterest Phuong could have kissed her for, but she didn't. Instead, she bundled her purchases in her arms and carried them out to her car. Ripping open a chocolate bar, she shoved it into her mouth as she returned to the highway, raising a cloud of red dust in her wake. When she saw a sign proclaiming that it was only 325 kilometers to Broome, she cheered so loud she almost choked. Less than half a day's drive and she'd be home. Funny how a place she'd never seen could be home, but when you had nothing else. Jason. She had to find Jason. Wherever he was would be safe and home. 24. Mr. Meyer. As if Zahn's morning wasn't already mad enough, a man wearing a khaki safari shirt and shorts burst into her office. Mr. Meyer, he's done it again. It's worse than ever. He won't move either. You've got to. He caught sight of Zahn and stopped dead. Where's Mr. Meyer? Toby coughed. Lee, this is Zahn Lane, the new manager. Mr. Meyer's replacement. Zahn wanted to strangle the man, but he was only stating the truth, at least as he saw it. This mess wasn't the night porter's fault. She summoned her most serene smile. Never mind that she had to grit her teeth and think about feeding the man responsible to the sharks in the lagoon in order to produce something more believable than a grimace. Lee eyed her nervously. I work in maintenance and someone logged a fault with the spa. When I went over to investigate. His eyes beseeched her to believe him. He was lying there unconscious. I can't wake him and I can't get him to move. A medical emergency she could handle, or at least she hoped so. Lead the way, Zahn commanded. Lee skittered out of the office and broke into a trot when they left the office. Zahn jogged to keep up as he led her past the gym and into what the sign said was the health club. Some health club. All she could see was a spa in a big pavilion, surrounded by decking and sun lounges. He's there. Lee pointed at a clump of potted palms. Zahn peered around the decorative trees. Oh God! She was profoundly glad she hadn't had breakfast yet. A near-naked man lay on the decking in a pool of what looked and smelled like vomit. It was like being back at the backpackers all over again. Only last week she'd had to deal with some drunken 20-year-old who'd discovered Australia's 18-plus drinking age at about the same time as he'd tried to drink Divers Tavern dry. Well, she had a bloody procedure for dealing with drunks. Get me a bucket. Lee vanished and returned with two, which he presented proudly. Zahn took them both and headed for the spa. When they were both filled with tepid water, she dumped the contents of one on Mr. Drunk and Disgusting. As predicted, he came up spluttering, but Zahn had another bucket in reserve in case he turned violent. This time she didn't need it. He glared blearily at her before sagging back to the decking. Fuck off. Zahn handed her empty bucket to Lee and gestured for him to refill it while she advanced on the Drunk with the full one. This time, she deliberately poured it over his head. "Fuck off," the man roared, sitting up. "I'll see you fired for this." He glared at Zan and her heart stopped. The drunk was Jay, minus his bourbon. "No, you won't. I'm the manager of the hotel. No one here has the authority to fire me." At least, she hoped so. "Fucking can." He picked up a battered-looking pink frangipani and twirled it between his fingers before throwing it down. Jay squinted at her. "You're new. Have I fucked you yet?" "Gotta do that first." He tugged at the waistband of his shorts. Zan took a deep breath. Fury burned through her bones, but her voice was level. "You don't have a snowball's chance in hell, so better keep your pants on, mate. If you don't get up now, and I mean right now, and take your hangover to the privacy of your hotel room, I'll have you removed from the island. This is a resort. The other guests who want to use the health club should be able to do so without having to see this." Lee sidled over. "Ms. Lane, you can't make him leave. Mr. Meyer tried that, but he just comes back. You can't keep him off the island. He owns the hotel." Jay's smug smile told her he'd heard every word. Thank heaven she'd thought to get that probation clause removed from her contract, though she thought she knew why Meyer had agreed to it. The bastard didn't want her skipping out when she discovered that he'd bolted. Well, she'd be pushing her luck to the limit today. "Really? So that makes you staff? Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Zan Lane, the new manager at Romance Island Resort. If you ever, and I mean ever, suggest that I have sex with you, I'll report you for sexual harassment. And if that flowers any evidence to go by, I won't be the only one. I'll call the receptionist, Heloise, and see if she has a complaint to make." Jay grinned and winked. "Baby, no woman who spends the night with me has anything to complain about." Those eyes, the shit-eating grin she wanted to wipe off with a well-placed foot, Zan gasped. She knew him, and not just from that night on the jetty. He'd cut his hair, so she hadn't recognized him at first. This was the arrogant ass who'd been lording it over his harem in Matzo's all those months ago. What was his name? J. Felix? If this man was his boss, no wonder Maya had left. But if she wanted to stay in Australia, she couldn't quit. That meant gaining the upper hand over this asshole rockstar and never giving an inch. Thank heaven she hadn't done anything but stare at the stars with him on Friday night. "Mr. Felix, go home. You've made a spectacle of yourself, but that's your job, isn't it? Well, running the hotel is mine. So while you go hole up with whoever your current companion is, I have work to do." She turned to wide-eyed Lee. "Can you help Mr. Felix home, please?" "Jay." "It's Jay," he insisted, glaring at her. Finally, she'd gotten through to him. Well, irritated him at least. Good. She wanted him to dislike her so much he went to wherever his real home was. Anywhere but here, because Zan intended to stay. It was either that or go home, where she'd be forced to see Jerome and Kelly every day. She'd settle in hell first. Zan watched Jay stagger to his feet and stumble drunkenly away from the health club, Lee dogging his heels but not daring to speak to the man. Or for an asshole. Jay didn't deserve it, no matter how many hotels he owned. Shaking her head, Zan trudged back to her office. She'd managed the backpackers without any problem, and she'd been damn good at it. Good enough to land this job, that's for sure. How much harder could managing a resort be? 25. Romance Island Resort? That's the celebrity place up in the Buccaneer Archipelago. Your best bet's to go to the airport and hire a helicopter, the woman in the Broome Visitor Center said, eyeing Phuong's dusty clothes as if she knew the girl could barely afford a bus fare, let alone a whole helicopter. Isn't there a boat? Phuong asked weakly. The supply boat the staff use from the Pearl Farm, yeah. The woman nodded as if everything made sense now. Are you starting work at the resort? I heard they were in need of staff with the dry season not far off. Maybe. I'm supposed to meet someone who works there. Phuong pushed the map across the counter. Can you show me on this how to drive to the boat dock? The woman shrugged. Sure, but you'll need a four-wheel drive and that's only if the road's open. There's been some flooding with the recent storms. Tell me about it. I've driven up from Geraldton. I didn't know the highway was closed until after I got to the barrier at this end. Flooded rivers, roads, it can't be as bad as I've already driven through. If you say so. She pointed at the map with her pen. Now you're here, so you follow this road until you hit the highway, then head northeast until you get to the turnoff with all the signs. Turn left there. Follow it for a couple 100 kilometers until you see the Pearl Farm on the right. The boat schedule depends on the tides, but the skipper lives at the farm, so they'll know when the next one leaves. Wanting nothing more than to burst into tears at the thought that she was still hours from her destination, Phuong thanked the woman and dragged herself back to her car. For a moment she considered spending the night in a hotel, or more likely a cheap backpacker's dorm, because that was all she could afford. But the siren call of Jason waiting for her was too much to bear. She couldn't stop now. If she kept going, she'd get to meet him tonight. Smoothing the map out on the passenger seat, Phuong gunned the engine and set off for what she hoped was the final leg of her trip. A couple 100 kilometers was nothing, she'd driven more than twice that most afternoons. And Jason was at the end of it. How could she even think of delaying? Romance Island Resort, here I come, she thought, stomping on the accelerator. Houses quickly gave way to pinned and scrub once more. Broome retreated into memory as little more than a rust-tinted dream. Just a little longer and she'd be safe. The promised turnoff appeared, signposted with more warnings than she'd ever seen before. Crocodiles, fires, cows, they whizzed past before she'd had time to read more than half of them. If she did, she knew they'd only frighten her. She'd driven this far, how much worse could it get? It's not like she intended to stop now. Nothing could be worse than what she'd endured already. Phuong was certain of that. Grimly, she pushed her protesting car to the speed limit, then a little past it for good measure. Her tires ate up the road as the afternoon light tinted the road gold, then red like the rusty ramparts on either side. The car jolted, its tires grinding as if she'd driven off the road and onto the gravel siding, but she was still firmly on the road. A glance in her rearview mirror showed the dusty bitumen ribbon trailing off into the distance, so she followed the unsealed dirt track it had become. Her teeth jarred as the car bounced and jutted across endless ridges of hard-packed red dirt. Soon a cloud of dust obscured the road behind her. Phuong could only go forward as fast as she dared, feeling like her car and her very bones would be shaken apart by the rippled road. Red dust in front and rust cloud behind, if there was a road to hell, this looked like it. No, a road out of hell, she promised herself. A road to paradise, if such a place existed. Jason told her it did and that he lived there. Damn it, she'd seen pictures. Those photos of the beach. A sharp crack jolted through the car, so it skidded off its straight path and into the middle of the road. Yanking at the steering wheel, Phuong tried to force her sluggish car back to the left-hand side where it belonged, but it didn't seem to want to listen. The car shuddered again and slowed, slewing toward the mound of dust marking the border between road and bush. She felt rather than heard the side of the car scrape against the sandy barrier, but she couldn't seem to pull away. Instead, she was losing speed as the dust dragged her to a halt. No. She couldn't stop here. Her car couldn't give up here. Phuong threw open the door and lurched to her feet. She inhaled a lungful of dust and found herself coughing instead of shouting at her car for quitting now, when they were so close. Her car canted over on one side as if there was a ditch below the dust rampart, but Phuong couldn't see any ditch, not even when she crouched down and tried to peer under the car. No, it looked like both the tires on the passenger side were flat, and the car now rested on the wheel rims on that side. Phuong had never changed a car tire in her life, and even if she had, she didn't have two spares. Only one, maybe. She sank to her knees in the dirt. What to do? Should she stay with the car and hope someone else drove down the gritty track, someone kind enough to give her a lift to her destination? Who would be crazy enough to attempt this road? It had no street lights, no bitumen, and the sun was slowly sinking out of sight. And what if the next car was a police car, come to cart her back to Perth and Norman? Phuong forced herself to her feet. If the choice was back to hell or forward into the future, she'd take the future on foot if she had to. Gritting her teeth, she hefted her bag onto her shoulder and pocketed the car keys. Her car might be a quitter, but she wasn't. What more could this stupid road throw at her? Cows? Crocodiles? Ha! She'd turn their skin into shoes before she'd let anything else get between her and Jason. 26. 2 days. It took Zan 2 very dull days of skimming through paperwork before she felt she truly had a handle on resort operations. Profit margins were slim because expensive luxury resorts weren't in as high demand during the recent economic slump. The mining industry downturn hadn't helped matters. Fewer guests could afford the place, but rising costs meant they couldn't drop the fancy price tag. As for the rising costs, she could lay a lot of them firmly at Jay's door wherever it was. Since he'd first arrived at the resort, staff turnover rates had reached a record high. One week they'd lost 10 staff, and 8 of those were new hires who'd only started work that week. Smelling a rat, Zan had checked the personnel files. Sure enough, the staff were all women under 30 who'd been dismissed for fraternization. Further research through the hotel's intranet revealed a fraternization policy, or more accurately, a policy that said there was to be no such thing between staff and anyone on the island. The policy had been changed exactly 1 week after Jay's arrival, the same day as the previous activities manager had resigned. A meeting with the human resources officer had been illuminating. One of Jay's early conquests at the hotel had informed one of the hardcore fan sites for Jay's band that his current hideaway was hiring staff. The anonymous Miss P had linked the resort's advertisement for cleaning staff, with a note underneath that the only room servicing they'd actually do would involve the rockstar himself. They'd hired and fired a dozen girls who couldn't even operate a vacuum cleaner before one of them whined about the job being nothing like she'd signed up for, and she clued them in about the fansite ad. Now they had no cleaning staff for the peak season, even after 2 rounds of applications, because the housekeeping manager flatly refused to interview anyone else. She then produced a series of increasingly heated emails between Maya and Annette, the housekeeping manager, dating back to when Jay had apparently first purchased the hotel during the peak season the previous year. Around the time of her own arrival in Broome, Zan mused, and when she'd seen the prick for the first time. The resort was in trouble and Jay was just the turd on the cake. She'd need a plan, 2 of them probably. One to keep Jay out of her hair and maybe even get him to leave the island, and one to attract more guests to the hotel. The thought was exhilarating. For the first time, she'd get to properly use her degree and at a place as awesome as Romance Island. She almost forgave Maya for not straight out telling her about the change of position. Almost. The signs had all been there. He'd asked interview questions about her experience in supervising and retaining staff, working without supervision. And the kicker was when he'd seemed surprised that all she wanted to discuss about her contract was the probation period. Zan had checked the original emailed contract. Sure enough, it said she was agreeing to be the hotel manager too. As for her visa documents, Zan grimaced. Her visa was dependent on her retaining her position as the hotel's manager. Any change effectively nullified her visa and put her on the first plane home. The one place in the world she didn't want to be. Bugger Jerome and his betrayal. If he hadn't slept with Kelly, hadn't deserted Zan and been too much of a bloody coward to tell her, she would have read everything properly. She wouldn't have missed details like agreeing to run a whole hotel instead of just their tours. If she told anyone how badly she'd stuffed up, she'd lose any respect the existing staff might have for her. What was an already challenging job would become downright impossible. She'd be damned before she gave up. At least, if she gave up before she found out if there really was a lagoon monster. Zan laughed. The sound echoed off the tiles and bare walls, but she didn't care. Sometime over the last 2 days, she'd started thinking about the island as hers. Jerome and Kelly and Jay could go to hell for all she cared. She'd just been handed the biggest opportunity of her career, and she was going to make the most of it. Just as long as she didn't mess it up. That meant getting the lay of the land before she started putting plans in place. Sighing, she switched off her PC and made her way to the staff dining room. The sounds of clinking crockery and muffled laughter reached her before she stepped inside, but it already held a comfy camaraderie she'd never known at the Backpackers. These staff had worked together for years through changes in ownership and now new management. They knew the resort better than she ever could without putting in the same time and dedication, and they all had their own ideas on how the place should be run. Zaan glanced around. Who hadn't she sat with yet? Her eyes landed on a table occupied by two men who obviously worked in IT. It was time she learned about the resort's computer system and the wristbands everyone wore. As it was, Jay knew the ID system better than she did, and that would never do. He might own the hotel, but it was her baby now. 27. Day 3. Zaan couldn't wait to get started. She'd woken a dozen times in the night with ideas about how to entice new guests to the resort. Romance Island would blossom under her care. She breathed in the awakening aroma from her coffee cup and gazed at the piece of paradise framed by her office window. A jetty thrusting out into the aqua blue sea, while the teasing water licked and kissed the jetty's legs in torturous foreplay as it crept higher until it engulfed the jutting length completely in warm wetness. Where the hell had that come from? Zaan felt blood rushing to her face. She should have been talking to staff at breakfast, not reading the steamy book Annette from housekeeping had lent her yesterday. The island infrastructure shouldn't be seeing more action than she was. A rattling trolley broke the romance of the scene, wheeled by a girl in a maid's uniform. When she reached the end of the jetty, not its head, Zaan reminded herself. She lifted a hand to her eyes to scan the water. Zaan spotted it the same time as the girl, a boat skimming across the sea surface. She wasn't sure what intrigued her more, her first sight of the speeding carrier boat or the first woman under 30 she'd seen on the island in the week she'd been there. Down went the coffee and up she got, striding out the building and along the boat dock to where the girl waited. "Good morning," Zaan called, waving. The girl responded with a small smile and a chin lift that Zaan associated more with guys greeting than girls. Undeterred, Zaan closed the distance between them. "I'm not sure we've met. I'm Zaan Lane, the new manager." She held out her hand. "I'm Pamela, but you don't want to shake my hand right now, Ms. Lane." Pamela dropped her gaze to her shoes. "This trolley's full of dirty linen, ready to go to the mainland on the laundry truck. Maybe when I've washed my hands. I saw you in the staff dining room the other night. Mr. Meyer, he never ate with the rest of us, but I think you're different." She met Zaan's eyes once more and laughed a little. "You don't look old enough to be managing a whole hotel." "I'm probably not," Zaan found herself saying. "But I managed Broom backpackers at Cable Beach and I have a university degree in tourism management, so I am qualified." She sighed. "Meyer never told me why he picked me for the job. He just left." Pamela grinned. "Yeah, Mr. Meyer didn't like the new owner, but he's wanted to leave since before that. I often overheard Mr. Meyer talking to Dennis in security when I was cleaning the foyer. They'd get into one of Mr. Meyer's bottles of rum and spill all the resort's secrets." "Like what?" Pamela just shook her head. "Of course, solving the island's mysteries wouldn't be that easy." "So what do you think of the new owner?" Zaan persisted. More head shaking. "Jay Felix is a rock star. He owns the hotel, but he doesn't run it. We do. As long as I do my job and get paid for it, it doesn't matter to me who owns the place. This was my people's land long before there was any such thing as a hotel. The lagoon was my uncle's favorite spearfishing spot until his father sold it." Pamela's eyes misted over in keeping with her faraway smile. "I might be just a cleaner here, but I'm not stupid, Ms. Lane. I'm going to study nursing at Charles Darwin University this year, and first need this job to pay for my books and everything. Living off the land isn't as straightforward as it was before." Zaan couldn't seem to close her mouth. She wasn't sure whether to apologize or agree with her. Fortunately, a shout from the approaching boat ended their conversation as Baz, the skipper, insisted on being introduced. In the bustle of unloading and loading the boat, Zaan found herself alongside Pamela, tossing laundry bags to the deck, while Baz stacked boxes onto the empty trolley. "These came in on one of the scenic flights yesterday. They've been sitting in town for the last week, waiting for the road to reopen, but the bottle shop got sick of storing it, so they added it to our order." Max can stop complaining about his missing rum now. He hefted one more box onto the trolley. Hey, if you've replaced him, guess that's yours now, Zaan. Don't drink it all at once. Rum? A whole case of the stuff? Zaan hadn't drunk that much rum in her entire life. Hey, have you ever been jet boating in a whirlpool, Zaan? Her heart leaped. Zaan forgot about being the responsible manager of anything. No. Where do I sign up? It sounds awesome. She could always work late or through her lunch break to make up the time. And it sort of was work, familiarizing herself with the resort's supply lines between the island and the mainland. Baz jerked his head at the carrier boat. I got time now. I'm headed back to the farm to meet the truck, but they only reopened the road this morning, so the truck's at least an hour away. The tide's just right too. Bet you've never seen anything like the Kimberley tides where you're from. With a deafening clatter, Pamela began pushing the trolley back up the jetty toward the resort. In the UK, no, but I managed the backpackers at Cable Beach before I came here. Zaan feasted her eyes on the ocean she'd never, ever get enough of. If more people from home could see this place, they'd never leave. The UK would be empty. Baz chuckled. Yeah, most of the British explorers couldn't get enough of this part of the country. Lots of them died trying to tame it too. Can't tame the Kimberley. He shoved the last 2 laundry bags in a storage locker and slammed it shut. Grab a seat in the bow. You'll want to hang on when we get to Pearl Passage. It's a wild ride with the tide coming in. Zaan climbed aboard and straddled one of the seats at the front of the boat, glad she'd chosen to wear pants today. The boat was basically a giant inflatable with a carpeted deck and cushy foam roller coaster seats. Baz cast off and eased the boat away from the jetty until it pointed at the distant mainland. Hold on, he shouted as the engine's contented purr rose into a challenging roar. For a moment, they skimmed across the surface of the water, mounting a cresting wave before flying over the top to bump into the trough between it and the next. A spume of spray soaked Zaan to the skin, but she just laughed as she rode the best roller coaster she'd ever seen. Wind plastered her shirt to her chest. She was doubly glad she'd braided her hair today, or she'd look like she wore a seaweed wig when she returned to her office. What would it matter? She'd need to shower off the salt anyway. But later. Later, because right now she intended to just enjoy the moment, zipping across the water like a flying fish as the rust and cream-layered cliffs grew closer. The boat slowed, idling like the world's biggest aquatic motorcycle, and Baz bellowed, "The farm just radioed to say they need me to head straight back. You okay to come with me? You won't be stuck on the mainland for more than an hour or so when I do the next island supply run, or I can get Sho to run you back in the helicopter." "It's fine," she shouted back. She might as well see the facilities on the mainland and meet the rest of the staff at the Pearl Farm. Her plans for the resort would involve them too. "We're going into King Sound now and the tide's coming in, so it's going to get a bit rough. You'll need to hold on until we get through the whirlpools. They're pretty unpredictable. I'll do my best to get you close without going in, but that means turning suddenly. You ready?" Zaan pried one white-knuckled hand off the bar to signal a diver's okay in the air above her head. Even if she wasn't, there was no way on earth she'd back down now. Hell, she wanted to get behind the wheel of this baby herself, though it was probably safest that she didn't. She was a dive master, not a boat master. If ever an experience made her want to change that. Baz rounded the cliffs and the boat accelerated, carried by the racing tide. He swerved and sent the boat careening around the edge of a spectacular vortex, before the surface smoothed like a placid lake, only for turbulence to swirl another into being directly ahead of them. Zaan tipped sideways, holding on for dear life as Baz dodged around rocks and whirlpools, whooping at the top of his lungs. Not that Zaan was any quieter, but she cherished the hope that Baz would be a gentleman about it, and not tell the resort staff that she was a screamer. Who needed sex when adrenaline-pumping whirlpool surfing was part of your normal workday? The warmth of the sun heated her skin as the demanding wind caressed her body through her clothes. The bass rumble of the engine thrummed until her bones vibrated right along with it, the sheer power of all of it fighting with the mighty ocean for control over her body, thrusting her deep into her seat like an impatient lover who would not be denied. She felt like she'd swallowed a case of champagne, but the taste of salt on her lips told her otherwise. No sex was this good. Zaan sat back, laughing quietly to herself. She felt the boat slow, but the steamy humidity that settled on her as they approached the farm didn't make it easy for her to catch her breath. She fanned her face, hoping Baz didn't notice, but as he pulled up in the shallows, Zaan found him at her side, offering a hand to help her off the boat. She accepted his assistance, staggering to her feet on rubbery legs that felt like she'd engaged in a marathon of a very different sort. "Was it as good for you as it was for me?" Baz asked. Zaan couldn't wipe the grin off her face as she replied, "Oh no, it was better." She burst out laughing when Baz blushed bright red. They parted on a pretty lawn beside the pool, with Baz promising to come get her when it was time to leave again. In the meantime, maybe she'd like to grab a drink in the restaurant upstairs? The Pearl Farm restaurant wasn't open yet, but the manager offered to make Zaan a coffee anyway, which she gratefully accepted. Ambrosia, especially after leaving her first coffee back on her desk at the resort. The thrilling ride had been worth it, plus she still had the trip home to look forward to. Zaan hoped she'd have the stamina for a second round on the jet boat. She glanced at the TV in the corner, recognizing one of the morning shows that was equal parts news and sales pitch for whatever products paid to advertise with them. Today's news was about the stupid but tragic things tourists did when they didn't understand the harsh environment out here. A couple of backpackers' bodies had been found, drowned in a flooded river south of Headland. The frowning news anchor said they were still looking for a third tourist whose body hadn't yet been found, though she was seen traveling with the other two. Zaan shook her head. She didn't want to hear any more. Too many tourists took risks that cost them their lives. Driving onto a flooded road was more dangerous than you realized, if you didn't know how deep it was. She didn't want to see the faces of this bunch of unfortunates. What if they were guests she'd met at the Broome Backpackers? Nodding her thanks to the manager, she left the restaurant and perched on a rock beside the horizon pool. She wanted to get back to Romance Island. There was so much to do. As if he'd read her mind, Baz appeared at the top of the steps. To be fair, just his head appeared, huffing and puffing, then his torso several thumping steps later, followed by the rest of him, half leaning on the handrail and thoroughly out of breath. He took his time recovering before he said, "Right. Next time I'm going to shout at you from the boat ramp below. We're just loading the boat up now. Should be 15, maybe 20 minutes and we'll be on our way back. And I've got a passenger." New staff member headed out to the hotel for the first time. Her car broke down on the road a ways back, so she didn't arrive until this morning in the laundry truck. "Come and I'll introduce you." He waved her over and started down the steps again. New staff? She hadn't approved any new staff. Something smelled fishy and it wasn't the farm's oysters. Zaan strode after Baz, expecting trouble. She wouldn't be disappointed. 28. "It's been days, baby. Why won't you talk to me?" "Days? How many days?" "Too many." He'd sent message after message, full of frogs and mermaids and other half-remembered fairy tale stuff, but Phuong hadn't responded. He'd scared her off by talking about nights and proposals, but he'd expected one of her sassy comebacks, not silence. Silence for fucking days. What had he done wrong? Not drunk enough bourbon, that's what. Pity there was none left. He'd have to visit the bar and liberate some more. Maybe there was something in those romance books that he'd missed. After all, they were basically adult fairy tales, ending happily ever after with awesome sex. Everything should end with awesome sex. And start with it too. Jay hoisted himself off the couch and padded outside. His bare feet made almost no sound on the sand as he avoided the well-lit public pathways by taking the secret jungle tracks he'd made in his time on the island. This one was the most well-worn, probably because it led to his two favorite places, the library and the pub. Not that he wanted to keep his visits to the pub secret. His trips to the library, however, what would people say if they saw him with an armload of romance books? Nobody would believe that he was trying to research the fuck out of the things. Because being a rock star wasn't enough. He knew that now. Now that he wasn't one anymore, not really. He figured he still had rock god status, but he wasn't a star anymore if he didn't perform. That's why he'd gone for a girl with a foreign-sounding name who was looking for a fairy tale, because he figured he could deliver on that bit if he just read enough of the right books. He'd read them again and again, the ones on mail-order brides, until he knew what he'd done wrong. He'd send another message, the perfect one that made everything all right again, and she'd come to the island and they'd live happily ever after and shit. Yeah. He rounded the last palm tree, edging carefully past the spiky pandanus, before emerging behind Maya's house. No, not anymore. Maya had left, hadn't he? There was a new manager. The bitch with the bucket, who'd tried to drown him the other day. Jason glanced at the veranda and grinned. The stacked boxes of supplies by her front door gave him a brilliant idea for revenge. Maya had always ordered a case of rum with his food order, and there it was, right on top. He just felt like a drink too. He ripped into the box and grabbed 2 bottles of rum. Tucking them under his arms, he whistled as he walked through the deserted staff dongas to the library. It wasn't open to guests yet, but that wouldn't stop him. His ID was a skeleton key, allowing him entry to everywhere at the resort. One swipe and the library door slid open to welcome him inside. The door hissed shut behind him, and not a moment too soon, he heard male voices and approaching footsteps. Good thing he knew the resort's security system so well. Tapping his wristband, Jay set a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the library door, effectively locking it against everyone else at the resort. Now he could read in peace. Grabbing a book in one hand and a bottle in the other, he unscrewed the cap and took a swig. Fuck yeah. This was the life. Reading with rum. By the end of the day he'd charm Phuong's pants off. Just like Americans in books did to their mail-order brides.